Hey guys, tonight we are going to bundle up, metaphorically speaking, and venture into a historical deep freeze. We're heading to Finland not for saunas and snowmobiles, but for a period of profound hardship in the mid-19th century that most history books just skip. Imagine a place where the sun barely shows its face for months and the ground is harder than concrete. Now imagine the food running out. Yeah, it wasn't a good time. This isn't your average bedtime story. And you probably won't survive this hour without feeling at least a little pang of, oof, glad I'm not there. But hey, that's what makes history interesting, right? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing at the edge of a vast, silent forest. It's winter in Finland sometime in the 1860s. The air nips at your cheeks, sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and frost. Snow lies heavy on the branches, muffling sound, turning the world into a hush of white and gray. The sun, if it bothers to make an appearance, is a pale, weak disk hanging low on the horizon, offering light but precious little warmth. This isn't the postcard version of winter, the one with rosy cheeks and snowball fights. This is the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays there. You can almost feel the chill right through your screen, can't you? A little shiver down your spine. Good, you're getting it. Finland in the mid-19th century wasn't the prosperous, technologically advanced nation you might know today. It was a grand duchy, an autonomous part of the vast Russian Empire, maintaining its own laws and institutions, but ultimately subject to the Tsar's will. Think of it as sharing an apartment with a very large, unpredictable roommate who sometimes decides where you put the couch. Most of the population lived in rural areas tied to the rhythm of the seasons and the yield of the land. Life was hard-scrabble, dependent on agriculture, in a climate that was, shall we say, less than forgiving. You're relying on crops like rye barley and potatoes, things that should grow reasonably well, even with a short growing season, but everything hinges on the weather cooperating. And as we'll see, the weather was about to stage a dramatic, unhelpful protest. The sheer scale of the place hits you as you look around. Forest covers swaths of the land interspersed with lakes that are now solid sheets of ice. Habitation is sparse, scattered farms and small villages clinging to the landscape like hardy lichen. Travel is difficult, especially in winter. Roads are poor, distances are vast, and the snow makes everything slow or harder. Communication is rudimentary by modern standards. No instant texts or tweets here. News travels by word of mouth, by letter, carried by slow transport, or eventually by newspaper reports that are weeks or months behind the reality on the ground. Imagine trying to coordinate a crisis response when your main way of getting information is a guy on a horse who might get stuck in a snowdrift. It adds a whole new layer of complexity, doesn't it? The history we're diving into tonight is often overlooked outside of Finland. It's one of those events that got overshadowed by bigger, louder disasters happening elsewhere in the world, or maybe it just wasn't considered sexy enough for the history books. No great battles, no sweeping political revolutions, just a quiet, grinding struggle against nature and circumstance. But it was utterly devastating for the people living through it. You are walking, virtually speaking, in their footsteps now, feeling the crisp air, the quiet, the isolation. It's a world away from your comfy spot, isn't it? Good, that disconnect helps us appreciate the severity. The primary source of sustenance for most Finns was grain. Rye for bread, barley for porridge or beer. Potatoes were also gaining popularity, offering a more reliable yield in some areas. Animal husbandry played a role, but crops were king. And farming here was always a gamble. The growing season was short, the soil wasn't always the richest, and late frosts or early snows could wipe out a year's hard work in the blink of an eye. You plant your seeds, you tend your fields, and you cross your fingers, hoping the sun shows up. The rain falls just right, and the frost stays away until harvest. It's a nerve-wracking way to live, especially when your family's survival depends on it. It makes you appreciate modern supply chains, doesn't it? You probably don't spend your evenings worrying if the local supermarket's shipment of bread will freeze on the truck. Though depending on where you live, maybe you do. Historians still argue whether the Finnish climate itself was the primary villain, or if societal factors like reliance on specific crops or inadequate infrastructure played a larger role in turning bad weather into a full-blown catastrophe. It's a classic chicken and egg scenario, or perhaps more accurately, a frost and starvation scenario. Was the weather unusually cruel, or was the system simply too brittle to withstand a typical shock? It's a debate that matters when we try to understand why some societies collapse under pressure while others adapt. You're essentially standing in the middle of that debate right now, seeing the setting where those forces collided. Beyond the harsh climate and the agricultural challenges, there's the political context. Finland was part of Russia, but it wasn't simply absorbed. It retained a degree of autonomy established when Russia annexed it from Sweden earlier in the century. This meant it had its own government, the Senate, based in Helsinki. This Senate was responsible for the internal affairs of the Grand Duchy. So while the Tsar was the ultimate authority, the immediate response to a domestic crisis, like famine, fell to these Finnish officials. This dual layer of governance would prove interesting, let's say, when things started to go seriously wrong. It's like having two bosses, one who's always in the room and one who lives across the country but holds the purse strings. Coordinating anything tends to get complicated. The general picture in the early 1860s, before the truly terrible years hit, was one of quiet progress mixed with persistent vulnerability. There were efforts to improve agriculture, build infrastructure, and modernize the economy. But these were slow, uneven processes. The vast majority of people were still living much as their grandparents had, tied to the same land, facing the same basic risks. Education levels were relatively low in rural areas, and information about new farming techniques or economic opportunities didn't spread quickly. You're standing in a world where tradition and necessity hold sway, where the wisdom passed down through generations is your primary guide. And innovating isn't just difficult, it might feel outright risky when failure means not eating. Think about your own life for a second. The safety nets you have, the ease with which you can buy food access information or travel. Now strip all of that away. Replace it with deep winter miles of forest and a dependency on the few handfuls of grain you managed to coax from the ground last summer. It changes your perspective, doesn't it? This wasn't some abstract historical event happening to nameless people far away. This was life for millions of people just a few generations ago. They woke up, felt the cold, worried about the snow, and prayed for spring, just like you might yearn for the weekend, but with significantly higher stakes. It makes your Monday morning commute seem almost pleasant by comparison. Almost. Life wasn't always about hardship, of course. There were market days, church gatherings, community events, the simple joys of family life. People weren't perpetually miserable. They lived and loved and laughed within the constraints of their world. But those constraints were tight and the margin for error was vanishingly small. A bad harvest wasn't just an economic setback, it was an existential threat. And they were standing on the precipice of not just a bad harvest, but a string of them combined with weather so brutal, it seemed almost malicious. The journey we're beginning tonight takes us into that quiet, frozen landscape as it's about to be gripped by a crisis unlike any it had faced before in living memory. It's a story about vulnerability, resilience, and the lengths people will go to survive when the most basic necessities are stripped away. And yes, it ultimately leads to a law about bark bread, which might sound mundane. But trust me, by the end of this journey, you'll understand exactly why such a law was necessary and what horrors it was meant to prevent from ever happening again. You're settled in good, because the frost is deepening and the first hints of real trouble are just beginning to appear on the horizon. The quiet, snow-covered world is about to get very, very loud with the sounds of distress. The crisp air you felt settling around you at the end of our last moment together. Well, imagine it not leaving. Not just for a few weeks or even a couple of months, but dragging on month after month, refusing to yield to the expected warmth of spring. You stand there scanning the still frozen landscape in the early part of 1866, feeling that familiar ache of anticipation. Surely any day now, the sun will gain strength, the snow will begin its slow retreat, and the earth will shrug off its icy blanket, ready to receive the precious seeds. This is the rhythm of life, you know, the cycle you depend on. But this year, the rhythm is off. Way off. Spring is stubbornly late. The kind of late that makes farmers chew on their lower lips and cast anxious glances at the gray, unmoving sky. The snow cover persists longer than anyone can remember. Lakes and rivers remain locked in ice when they should be flowing freely, their surfaces rippling under a gentle breeze. You hear whispers among the villagers, concerned murmurs about the frost that just won't release its grip. Every morning you wake up, look outside and see the same white landscape, the same skeletal trees outlined against a pale sky. It starts to feel less like a season and more like a permanent state of being. The earth is simply refusing to wake up. When the thaw finally does begin, it's hesitant, grudging, and then cruelly it often refreezes. Nights are still biting cold, dipping well below freezing, even as the calendar insists it should be warming up. This stop-start melting process is terrible for the land. It creates icy patches that linger in the soil delays, plowing, and makes the ground heavy and waterlogged in some areas, while still frozen solid in others. Planting is delayed, pushed back week after agonizing week. And in a region with an already desperately short-growing season, every single day counts. Losing a week or two, or even 3 weeks at the start of the season, is like hitting the snooze button on your alarm when you really, really need to catch an early train. Except the train is your entire food supply. You finally get the seeds into the ground, pushing them into soil that feels reluctantly damp or frustratingly cold. You hold your breath waiting for those first green shoots. They emerge eventually, but the delays mean they are starting from behind, and the weather doesn't improve much. Summer arrives theoretically, but it's not the warm, life-giving summer you desperately need. Instead, 1866 delivers a summer that feels more like a prolonged, chilly autumn. Temperatures remain unusually low. We're talking about average summer temperatures that were several degrees Celsius below the norm. Think of trying to grow delicate crops in weather that feels like constant drizzle and a persistent damp chill. It's less beach holiday, more miserable camping trip where you forgot your waterproofs. The air is often damp heavy with rain or just a pervasive chill mist. Sunlight is scarce filtered through perpetual clouds. Crops need warmth and light to grow and ripen. They need those long, bright summer days that nudge them towards maturity. What they get in 1866 is disappointing. Rye, the staple grain, struggles. Barley, another key crop, fares little better. Potatoes, which had become increasingly important as a more reliable food source, are particularly vulnerable to damp and cold. They are prone to blight and simply don't develop properly without sufficient warmth. You walk through the fields you planted with such hope and your heart sinks. The plants are stunted, pale, listless. They look as miserable as you feel. This wasn't just a localized shower or a single cold snap. This was a systemic failure of the season itself across vast swaths of the country. The cold, wet summer of 1866 was, historically speaking, one of the coldest on record for Finland in the 19th century. That's your mainstream historical fact for this section. The summer of 1866 experienced a significant negative temperature anomaly across Finland, with average temperatures well below the long-term mean. For the farmers living through it, it wasn't a data point on a chart. It was a daily visible, terrifying reality unfolding in their own fields. You see the potential harvest literally failing before your eyes. Adding insult to injury, the brief lackluster summer gives way to an early autumn, and autumn brings with it the dreaded frost. A hard frost, not a gentle dusting, descends upon the land, while many of the already delayed crops are still in the fields, still trying desperately to ripen. This early frost acts like a cruel executioner, killing the plants stone dead. Any grain that hasn't matured is ruined. Any potatoes still in the ground are damaged, often rotting quickly once thawed. The already meager prospect of a harvest shrinks to almost nothing. You walk through the frosted fields, the withered stalks crunching underfoot, and the sound is like the shattering of your hopes. Imagine working all spring and summer, battling the weather, pouring your energy into nurturing your crops, and then just as they might possibly reach maturity, a single cold night wipes out months of effort. It's financially devastating, obviously, but it's also psychologically crushing. It feels unfair, a betrayal by nature itself. This is where you might hear old stories, brought up tales of past hardship, perhaps even superstitions about why the seasons have turned against them. Was it a sign? Had they angered something or someone? When science can't explain the immediate brutal reality, folklore often steps in. Historians still argue whether this specific sequence of weather events in 1866 was primarily due to natural climate variability or if it was influenced by larger global phenomena. There's been discussion, for instance, about the lingering atmospheric effects of a massive volcanic eruption like the 1865 eruption of Mount Tarawera in New Zealand, potentially contributing to cooler temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere. It's a fascinating point of debate. Was this purely bad luck driven by local Finnish weather patterns? Or were they victims of a climate domino effect triggered half a world away? You're standing in the middle of that uncertainty, feeling the undeniable freezing consequences regardless of the cause. The crop failures of 1866 weren't uniform across the entire country. Some northern areas used to shorter seasons and hardier varieties might have fared marginally better initially, or were perhaps already relying on subsistence methods that buffered them slightly. But the core agricultural regions, the places where the bulk of the food was grown, were hit incredibly hard. The harvest, such as it was drastically reduced. In some areas, it was close to zero. This wasn't just a poor harvest, it was a catastrophe. You hear reports filtering in from neighboring villages, then from further afield. The story is the same: little or no grain, few usable potatoes. The granaries that should be filling up for the winter are empty. The sheer scale of the failure starts to dawn on you. This isn't something you can just shrug off and buy more food next week. Food security in this era and place was hyper-local. You ate what you grew or what your immediate neighbors grew and traded. When everyone around you has nothing, where do you turn? The concept of a robust national food distribution network didn't exist in the way we understand it today. Getting bulk supplies from one region to another was slow, expensive, and fraught with logistical challenges, especially as winter approached and travel became even more difficult. Imagine trying to ship tons of grain by horse-drawn sleigh over hundreds of miles of snowy, undeveloped roads. It's enough to make you appreciate heated delivery vans, isn't it? The initial reaction among many was probably disbelief, then fear. You worked so hard, followed the old ways, did everything you could. How could the earth yield so little? The stark reality sets in as the first snows of the next winter begin to fall in late 1866. You look at your empty larder, your nearly empty grain sacks, and you understand that the hardship of the past spring and summer was just the beginning. Winter is coming, and you have next to nothing to eat. That gnawing anxiety in your stomach isn't just from hunger yet. It's from the horrifying anticipation of hunger. This weather wasn't an isolated incident either. While 1866 was the brutal trigger, the subsequent year, 1867, would bring its own set of climatic miseries, compounding the crisis and extending the period of starvation. But the foundation of the disaster was laid in that cold, wet, short summer and the killing frost of 1866. It stripped away the food reserves, ensuring that when winter arrived, millions of people were starting from a position of extreme vulnerability. It's like being told you have to run a marathon, but someone stole your shoes and gave you a backpack full of rocks right at the start line. You might wonder, surely they had some on reserves, some way to tide themselves over. For many subsistence farmers, reserves were minimal, even in good years. They grew enough to eat, perhaps a little extra to sell or trade, and enough seed grain for the following year. The concept of large multi-year reserves held by individuals or even communities wasn't widespread. Life was lived much closer to the margin. A single bad year was difficult. 2 or 3 in a row, which is what they were heading into, was truly ruinous. It makes you think about the just-in-time supply chains we rely on today. We're perhaps not as far removed from vulnerability as we like to think. The feeling in the villages shifts from hopeful anticipation to grim resignation, and then to outright panic as the severity of the harvest failure becomes undeniable and the cold tightens its grip. People start making difficult choices. Do you eat the seed grain you were saving for next spring? Do you sell your livestock at a terrible price before you can no longer feed them? Do you try to leave and seek help elsewhere? These aren't abstract questions. They are immediate, pressing dilemmas that families across the country were forced to confront as the reality of the failed harvest of 1866 settled in like the perpetual frost. The silence of the snowy landscape is now tinged with the unspoken fear of the long, empty winter ahead. The weather didn't just destroy crops, it shattered the fundamental sense of security that comes from knowing you can feed yourself and your family. You can almost hear the echoes of those difficult conversations carried on the cold wind. That chilling silence you heard settling in the one filled not with words but with the awful, unspoken dread of empty spaces. Well, it was the sound of granaries standing bare cellars, offering up only cobwebs, where roots should have been piled high. You walk into your small storage shed, the one that should be overflowing with the bounty of the year, and your boots echo on the floorboards. There are maybe a couple of sacks of grain, enough for a few weeks maybe, if you stretch it desperately thin, where there should have been dozens. The bins for potatoes hold only dirt clinging to the corners. Jars that would normally contain preserved berries or root vegetables are empty, reflecting your gaunt face back at you in their glass surfaces. The physical emptiness is a mirror for the emptiness in your stomach and the dawning panic in your mind. This wasn't just your problem. This was everyone's problem. News travels slowly, even in a small village. But the truth of the harvest failure couldn't be hidden. You'd see your neighbors, their faces ashen, standing in their equally empty sheds. The usual cheerful chatter about who had the best yield or the biggest pumpkins is replaced by tight-lipped silence or hushed, fearful conversations about what little they managed to salvage. The communal sense of shared prosperity, or at least shared subsistence, collapses under the weight of universal scarcity. There's no one to borrow from no one who had a miraculously good year to share their surplus, because there was no surplus. With the harvest gone, the first and most immediate consequence beyond the simple lack of food on the plate is the impact on the market. If there's anything at all available for sale, the price skyrockets. Suddenly, a small measure of rye grain costs what it used to cost to buy a whole sack. Those with even tiny amounts of food are understandably reluctant to sell, hoarding it for their own families. If they do sell, they demand exorbitant prices because they know you are desperate. It's basic supply and demand played out with terrifying stakes. You might have a little bit of money saved, or maybe a few items you could sell, a piece of furniture, an extra tool, perhaps a small amount of wool or linen. But as you watch the prices climb day by day, you realize that whatever meager funds you have won't buy enough food to last. It's like trying to do your weekly shop when milk costs 50 quid a pint. You just can't make the numbers work. The initial coping strategies are, as you'd expect, focused on stretching what little you have. Every crumb of bread, if you even have flour to make bread, is precious. Meals shrink in size and frequency. You start skipping meals, telling yourself you're not really that hungry yet, or giving your portion to the children. The feeling of hunger becomes a constant companion, a dull ache that sharpens into a painful knot in your stomach. You become acutely aware of every bodily sensation, the energy draining away the growing weakness in your limbs. Standing up too quickly makes the world swim. Laughter feels like a forgotten luxury. Families start to look at their assets in a new light. That cow you rely on for milk, if you can't feed her through the winter, she'll die anyway. Better to sell her now, even for a pittance, and use the money to buy some certain food, extending your survival by a week or two. The family pig, the same calculation. Farm tools, furniture, anything that isn't absolutely essential for immediate warmth or shelter becomes a potential bargaining chip against starvation. This process of selling off assets, known as destitution, strips families not only of their current means, but also of their future ability to recover. How do you farm next year if you've had to sell your plow or your horse just to survive this one? It creates a downward spiral that's incredibly hard to escape. You might try to rely on the natural world for help, but the environment that failed your crops isn't offering much solace either. Berries, if there were any left after a poor summer, are long gone. Fishing might be possible in some areas, but frozen lakes and rivers limit access. And even then, yields are likely lower as fish populations respond to environmental stress. Hunting is a possibility for some, but it requires energy you don't have, and animals are often scarce. The land that usually provides for you is now as barren and unforgiving as your empty shelves. One initial source of relief, or at least a desperate attempt at it, involved accessing whatever marginal food sources people traditionally used in lean times. Before the widespread adoption of potatoes, root vegetables like turnips or rutabagas were crucial. If any of these had managed to grow, they were dug up and eaten first. Wild plants traditionally gathered would be sought out, but in winter these options are severely limited. You'd scrape and search for anything edible. Perhaps the last remnants of hardy weeds or storage crops that didn't fully fail but were damaged. It was scavenging, pure and simple, a step down from farming or even foraging. The very act of desperation was demoralizing. The flow of information from the countryside to the authorities in the towns and cities was slow. Finland in the 1860s was vast, sparsely populated, and communications infrastructure was rudimentary. News of a poor harvest would arrive, but the true scale of the catastrophe, the near total failure in core regions, took time to become fully apparent. Officials initially received reports that were bad, certainly, but perhaps not conveying the utter completeness of the devastation in many areas. They might have thought it was a regional issue or simply a worse-than-average year, not a national crisis of unprecedented scale. This delay in fully grasping the situation meant the initial response was often inadequate and slow to materialize. Historians still argue whether the delay in the government's full-scale response was primarily due to a lack of accurate information reaching the capital quickly, or if there was also an element of bureaucratic inertia and underestimation of the severity of the reports they did receive. It's hard to say if it was willful blindness or just the inherent limitations of communication in the era. Meanwhile, in your village and thousands like it, the reality is stark. The meager national grain reserves that existed were quickly depleted or were simply too far away to be accessed by those in need before winter roads became impassable. Private merchants held some grain, but they were selling at prices that rapidly became astronomical, well beyond the reach of ordinary people. This is a mainstream historical fact of virtually every famine grain. Prices soar, making food inaccessible to the poorest, who are already the most vulnerable. The market in this scenario doesn't solve the problem. It exacerbates it, turning scarcity into starvation for those who can't pay. It's a grim reminder that sometimes the free market really means free to starve if you have no resources. You might hear stories, rumors filtering through the network of desperate people. Tales of someone in a distant village who supposedly had a small hidden store of grain, or a family who managed to slaughter a sheep before they got too weak to do it. These stories offered tiny fleeting sparks of hope, quickly extinguished by the overwhelming reality. More often, you'd hear accounts of deepening hardship, families going days without eating, children crying from hunger. The social fabric begins to fray under this immense pressure. While many people undoubtedly tried to help their neighbors, the sheer scale of the need meant that individual charity, while noble, was a drop in a rapidly emptying bucket. There's a strange, almost surreal aspect to this early stage of famine. You're surrounded by the familiar landscape, the houses, the people you know, but everything feels fundamentally different. The normal rhythm of life has stopped. There's no farming work, no harvesting, none of the usual seasonal tasks. Instead, days are dominated by the relentless search for sustenance. Scavenging, trying to sell something, queuing, hopefully if there's any talk of relief distribution, or simply sitting by the fire, trying to conserve energy and ignore the hunger pangs. It's a brutal, involuntary exercise in minimalism, where your possessions dwindle and your world shrinks down to the immediate, desperate need for food. You might find yourself doing things you never thought you'd do. Looking at your seed grain, the precious kernels saved for the future, and weighing the impossible choice, do you eat them now and guarantee starvation next year, or save them and potentially starve this year? Many face this agonizing decision, and many chose to eat the seed, prioritizing immediate survival over a future that seemed increasingly uncertain anyway. This act, repeated across thousands of households, guaranteed a further reduction in planted area the following spring, setting the stage for continued hardship even if the weather improved. Perhaps a quirky tidbit from this period, some records mention people attempting to eat things that were traditionally considered inedible, or only eaten in the most extreme emergencies. This might include boiling leather, trying to make broth from bones and animal hides, or consuming plants that were known to be bitter or difficult to digest, but offered some minimal calories. These weren't recipes. They were acts of pure desperation born from a profound lack of any other option. It speaks to the extent of the hunger when people resorted to consuming things that would make you feel ill even when not starving. The price increases weren't just inconvenient, they were a death sentence for the poor. Imagine watching the last bits of food dwindle, knowing that even if you could find grain for sale, the cost was now utterly prohibitive. This economic barrier, combined with the physical lack of food, created the conditions for widespread starvation. It wasn't just that food was scarce. It was that the market system, designed for times of relative abundance, utterly failed in the face of total widespread scarcity, effectively locking the most vulnerable people out of the food supply entirely. It highlights the fragility of relying solely on market mechanisms during a catastrophic production failure. As the winter of 1867 deepens, the initial shock and disbelief give way to a grim, pervasive understanding of the reality. The empty storehouses are not going to magically fill up. The high prices are not going to drop. The hunger is not going to go away. The conversation shifts from what little do we have to what else can we possibly eat? And the answers to that question become increasingly desperate and dark. The silence in the granary is now joined by the rumbling in your gut and the growing awareness that the worst is still yet to come. You are standing at the threshold of famine with nothing but thin air behind you and an unforgiving winter ahead. The silence in your granary wasn't just an absence of noise, it was an absence of possibility. The lack of food wasn't just hunger, it was the stark, terrifying realization that the usual world had ceased to exist. You had moved beyond scraping the bottom of the barrel. The barrel itself was gone, perhaps sold for firewood. The stage you're on now is one where survival means looking at the world around you not as a source of comfort or familiarity, but as a potential desperate and often horrifying larder. The things you considered food are gone. The things you considered barely edible are gone. Now you look at things that were never ever meant to be eaten by humans. This is where you start to see animal fodder less as feed for your precious now gone livestock and more as a potential meal. You might have saved some straw, some husks from the grain harvest that failed. Normally this is bedding or roughage for animals. Now you look at it and wonder if boiling it for hours might somehow extract some minuscule amount of nutrient. You quickly learn that it doesn't, not really. It's rough and digestible and provides more bulk than energy. Trying to eat straw feels like trying to chew on dried grass because, well, that's exactly what it is. It scrapes your throat and does nothing for the gnawing emptiness inside. It's a physical manifestation of how low you've sunk, chewing on something a cow would barely look at twice, and finding even that offers no real sustenance. Then your gaze turns to the forest. The evergreen trees that dominate the landscape, the stark, snow-dusted pines and spruces, suddenly look different. You know from stories from the absolute edge cases of previous hard years that people sometimes resorted to the forest, not for berries or mushrooms, or those are long gone anyway, but for the trees themselves. The bark, specifically the soft inner layer of bark, the phloem known as pettu in Finnish. It's found just beneath the rough outer bark. Scraping it off requires energy you don't have much of, and a tool, perhaps a knife or a sharp piece of metal salvaged from something else. Preparing this pettu is a process that tells you everything you need to know about its suitability as food. You have to scrape off the outer bark first. That's the rough, dead stuff. Then you peel or scrape away the thin, moist inner layer. It's bitter, resinous, and tough. You can't just eat it as is. Your stomach couldn't handle it, and even if it could, it would offer almost nothing. So you have to process it. You might try boiling it repeatedly, changing the water to leach out some of the bitter resins. This takes fuel, which is also becoming scarce. Then you have to dry it, perhaps by a dwindling fire or just letting it air dry. Once dried, it becomes brittle. Then comes the grinding. If you have a hand mill or even just stones, you grind the dried bark into a powder. This powder, this brown or reddish-brown dust, is your new flour. You mix this bark powder with whatever else you can find, perhaps a tiny bit of real grain flour, if you have any left, or maybe some dried moss or lichen you've managed to gather and process. The resulting mixture isn't appealing. It doesn't smell like baking bread. It smells like the forest floor, damp earth, and pine needles. When you mix it with water to try and bake it, it forms a dense, sticky dough that doesn't rise. Baking it produces what becomes infamously known as bark bread, petolapa. It's heavy, hard, and incredibly difficult to digest. Eating it is a chore. It tastes overwhelmingly of bitterness and resin. It fills your stomach with indigestible fiber, providing a temporary feeling of fullness, but delivering almost none of the calories or nutrients your starving body craves. Imagine chewing on this stuff. Your jaw aches. It's like eating sawdust mixed with pine sap. It sits like a brick in your stomach, causing pain and digestive upset. Diarrhea is common, which further dehydrates you and strips your body of what little nutrients it might have managed to extract. It's a cruel irony you are eating to survive, but the food you consume makes you sicker, weaker, and hastens the decline of your already frail body. This widespread reliance on bark and other non-traditional food sources like moss and lichens is a grim mainstream historical fact of this famine and many others where grain reserves ran out. Beyond bark, you might explore other things from the forest. Certain mosses and lichens can be processed, but they require extensive soaking and boiling to remove toxins and make them even remotely edible. Roots of certain plants might be dug up, but the ground is frozen solid for much of the winter, making this incredibly difficult. You become intimately familiar with the subtle signs of what might be edible, even if it's barely more than roughage, driven by a primal need to put something in your stomach. The knowledge of what you can and cannot eat from the wild becomes a matter of life and death passed down through generations of hard experience. But even that knowledge is stretched to its absolute limits. The psychological toll of eating these things is immense. You are reduced to consuming the same things that animals might nibble at, or things that don't feature in any cookbook ever written outside of a famine survival guide. It's a constant, humiliating reminder of your desperation and the complete collapse of your normal life. Every mouthful is a bitter pill to swallow both literally and figuratively. Your dreams when hunger allows you to sleep might be filled with feasts of real bread, butter and meat, only to wake to the harsh reality of the bark dust coating your tongue. As the local resources dwindle and the realization sets in that no help is coming to you, staying put starts to feel like a death sentence. If there's no food here, maybe there's food somewhere else. Maybe in a larger town or further south, where the harvest might not have been quite as bad. This thinking sparks the beginning of migration. For centuries, Finns had moved seasonally or regionally for work, but this is different. This is a desperate, often ill-prepared flight from starvation. The decision to leave your home, your village, everything you know, is agonizing. You have to choose who goes. Often it's the able-bodied adults hoping to find work or relief, and perhaps send something back or return when things improve. Sometimes whole families set out clinging together. You pack what little you have left that you can carry, perhaps an axe, a pot, a few scraps of cloth, maybe that bag of bark flour. You leave behind empty houses, weakened neighbors, and the graves that are starting to appear with disturbing frequency. There's no grand plan, no guaranteed destination, just a desperate hope that somewhere else is better than here. The journey itself is brutal. It's winter in Finland, remember? You're walking often hundreds of kilometers through snow and ice. Roads are poor or non-existent. You don't have proper winter gear because any extra clothing has probably already been sold or traded. Your shoes are worn, your stomach is empty, and your body is already weakened by malnutrition. You walk through frozen landscapes, the wind biting at your exposed skin. Finding shelter at night is a struggle. Maybe an abandoned barn, a lean-to, or just huddled together under a tree. The cold is a constant threat working in tandem with hunger to wear you down. You might join up with others doing the same thing, forming small, desperate groups. There's a kind of grim solidarity, a shared suffering, but also suspicion. Everyone is on the edge and resources are non-existent. You might share what little you have, but the pot is empty for everyone. Passing through villages, you might find doors closed against you. People fearful that you'll be a burden, or worse, bring disease. This fear wasn't unfounded. The movement of large numbers of weakened people in close proximity became a major factor in the spread of illness later in the famine. Where are you going? Perhaps towards the coast, towards the larger cities like Helsinki or Turku, where there might be imports of grain, or where the government might concentrate relief efforts. Perhaps towards areas rumored to have had slightly better harvests, though such rumors were often false. Perhaps towards Russia, the larger neighbor, in the desperate hope of finding work or aid there. This migration is a chaotic, unorganized surge of humanity, driven by the most basic instinct for survival. It's not tourism, it's not emigration with papers and plans. It's a desperate flight of refugees within their own country. Finding work is incredibly difficult. In a widespread economic collapse caused by famine, there's no demand for labor. Farmers can't afford to hire help. Industries are struggling. If you do find work, it's likely backbreaking labor for minimal pay, barely enough to buy a single loaf of real bread, if any is even available at a price you can afford. You might work constructing roads or railways projects the government sometimes initiated as a form of relief, but these were often far away. The conditions were harsh and the food provided was often inadequate. A quirky tidbit is that some of the railway lines built during this period are still in use today, grim monuments to the famine laborers who constructed them. Seeking official relief is another avenue, though initially this is fraught with difficulty. The government's initial response is slow and insufficient, a point we'll get to in more detail. Relief distribution points, when they are established, are often overwhelmed by the sheer number of people. The aid is too little, and the organization is poor. Queues are long, conditions are unsanitary, and despair hangs heavy in the air. You might walk for days to reach a place rumored to be giving out food, only to find the stores are empty or the distribution has already finished. This mass movement of people weakened by hunger and huddled together in makeshift shelters or overcrowded relief center creates perfect conditions for the spread of disease. Typhus, dysentery, smallpox, and other illnesses begin to take hold, scything through the already vulnerable population. It's a cruel multiplier effect. Starvation weakens the body, making it susceptible to disease. And the conditions created by the famine, overcrowding, poor sanitation during migration, and at relief points, facilitate transmission. Many people who didn't die purely from hunger succumbed to illness, brought on by their weakened state and the desperate search for survival. Historians still argue whether disease or direct starvation was the primary killer during the peak of the famine, as the two were so closely intertwined, each exacerbating the effects of the other. So your days are now filled not with farming, but with the grim routine of trying to find something to eat, perhaps boiling bitter bark or chewing on animal feed, and the exhausting, uncertain journey towards a hypothetical place where conditions might be better. The landscape outside your window, if you're still clinging to your home, or the endless white freezing landscape you're walking through, is no longer familiar and comforting. It is a hostile environment offering only hardship and the constant threat of death. You are reduced to the absolute basics, fighting for survival, using methods you never thought you'd employ. Your dignity slowly eroding with every mouthful of bitter bark and every mile trudged with an empty stomach. The hope of a return to normalcy seems increasingly distant, replaced by the immediate, all-consuming need to just make it through the next day. So while you're out there gnawing on tree bark and facing the relentless Finnish winter, a slow, almost glacial process is beginning in the capital, Helsinki. Far from the frozen fields and starving villages, in the comfortable, warm offices of the Senate, that's the governing body of the autonomous Grand Duchy of Finland under the Russian Empire, the first reports of widespread crop failure and hardship are starting to filter in. Now, Finland had experienced bad harvests before tough years where people tightened their belts and relied on reserves and ingenuity. But this felt different. The scale was unprecedented, but recognizing that truly grappling with the magnitude of the disaster unfolding across the nation took time. Bureaucratic time, which, as anyone who's ever waited in line at the DMV knows, is measured in geological eras. Initially, the reports probably sounded like exaggerated complaints from the countryside. Farmers always grumbled about the weather, right? Surely people would manage like they always had. There was perhaps an assumption that local resources, local charities, and the traditional resilience of the Finnish people would be enough to see them through. The structure of the government at the time, the Senate, was responsible for internal affairs, but it operated within the larger framework of the Russian Empire. While Finland had significant autonomy, particularly in its internal administration and economy, it wasn't an independent nation with a fully centralized system geared for rapid, large-scale disaster response. Think of it less like a modern emergency management agency and more like a slightly sleepy, slightly overwhelmed committee meeting miles away from the actual problem. The first official steps taken were tentative, and from your perspective, shivering in a makeshift camp, laughably inadequate. You might hear rumors distorted by distance and desperation that the government is doing something. Perhaps a small sum of money has been allocated. A committee, no doubt staffed by well-meaning but perhaps slightly out-of-touch officials, has been formed to investigate the situation. Investigations take time. Reports have to be written, memos sent, decisions debated. While the paperwork shuffled back and forth across polished desks, you were walking through snowdrifts, your stomach cramping. One of the earliest responses was a call for local and provincial authorities to handle the initial relief efforts. This sounds reasonable on paper, doesn't it? empower local communities. Except the local communities were the crisis points. Their resources were exhausted. They were the ones resorting to boiling shoe leather and praying for spring. Asking them to solve the problem was like asking a drowning man to build himself a boat using only his eyelashes. There was very little capacity at the local level for the kind of mass relief needed. They simply didn't have the food, the funds, or the infrastructure. There's also a significant economic dimension to the initial hesitation. The prevailing economic philosophies of the time, influenced by classical liberalism, often favored minimal government intervention in the economy, especially in areas like the grain market. There was a fear that government purchases or distribution of grain could disrupt normal trade, inflate prices, or create dependency. While this might make sense in normal times, though historians debate that too, during a famine of this magnitude, the normal market had ceased to function for the vast majority of the population. Grain was available elsewhere outside of Finland, but the starving masses had no money to buy it, and private merchants had limited incentive or capacity to import on the scale needed for pure relief. So the market-based approach, or the hesitation to interfere with it, contributed to the delay in government action. It's a bit like saying you won't provide umbrellas during a hurricane because you don't want to interfere with the hat market. Priorities, right? As the reports became more dire, as the sheer volume of people migrating and arriving in towns like Helsinki and Turku made the crisis impossible to ignore, the Senate did begin to ramp up its efforts, but the pace was still maddeningly slow. Imagine being one of those starving migrants reaching a city hoping for salvation, only to find limited disorganized relief efforts, if any. You'd see the signs of official activity, maybe notices posted or groups of officials looking concerned, but the actual food, the actual help was often nowhere near the scale required. You might queue for hours, days, even for a bowl of thin soup or a small ration of flour, only to be turned away when the supplies ran out. The frustration and despair would be immense, a cruel mockery of your arduous journey. Securing grain from abroad was the obvious solution, but even this was complicated. Russia, as the imperial power, was the natural first point of contact. However, Russia itself had experienced poor harvests in some regions, and there were internal pressures regarding its own food supply. Negotiations took time. Furthermore, there were issues of transportation. Finland's infrastructure wasn't designed for importing and distributing vast quantities of grain across a wide, sparsely populated, and often snowbound country. Ports could handle ships, but getting the grain from the ports to the inland areas where it was needed most was a monumental logistical challenge. The railways were limited, and roads were often impassable in winter. There was also the financial aspect. Buying grain required money, significant amounts of money. The Finnish government didn't have unlimited funds, and accessing credit or getting financial support from Russia or other European powers wasn't instantaneous. Pleas for international aid were made to Sweden, to Germany, to other countries, but these requests were often met with sympathy, but limited tangible assistance, at least initially. This is a mainstream historical fact. The initial response from both the Finnish government and international sources was insufficient given the scale of the catastrophe. A quirky tidbit illustrating the perhaps slightly misguided nature of some early efforts might involve the type of aid considered or provided. While grain was the critical need, some early proposals or small-scale donations might have focused on things like clothing or small sums of money which were useful, but didn't address the fundamental lack of calories. Or perhaps a plan for a specific relief project that was totally impractical given the conditions. One account mentions an early idea to distribute small loans to farmers to buy seed, which was completely useless if the farmer was already starving and had eaten his previous seed grain. It highlights a disconnect between the planners and the harsh reality on the ground. As the famine deepened and the death toll began to climb dramatically, the pressure on the Senate increased. The scale of the migration, the visible suffering in the towns, the reports from priests and local officials who were witnessing mass death. This gradually forced a more serious, if still somewhat reactive response. Relief committees became more active, albeit still struggling with logistics and resources. Larger sums of money were allocated. More determined efforts were made to secure grain imports. But precious months had been lost during the critical winter period when reserves ran out and people started dying in large numbers. Historians still argue whether the primary cause of the government's slow reaction was incompetence, a genuine lack of resources, political priorities that overshadowed humanitarian concerns, or simply a fundamental inability to grasp the unprecedented scale of the crisis until it was too late. It's easy in hindsight to point fingers, but understanding the pressures, the prevailing ideas, and the administrative capacity of the time is crucial. Was it a failure of imagination, a failure of will, or a failure of system? Likely it was a complex mix of all these factors creating a perfect storm of delayed response that allowed the famine to reach its devastating peak. From your perspective, trudging through the snow or huddled in a relief shelter that offers little relief, the reasons for the delay don't matter much. What matters is the empty bowl, the cold wind, the gnawing hunger, and the constant presence of death. You hear about the government's plans, maybe read a notice posted on a wall if you're literate, but it feels abstract, distant, almost irrelevant to your immediate, desperate struggle for survival. The wheels of bureaucracy turn slowly, especially when powered by fear and uncertainty rather than decisive action. It's like waiting for a delivery that was promised last year. You lose faith pretty quickly. The early government response then is characterized by underestimation, delay reliance on inadequate local structures, bureaucratic inertia, and perhaps an ideological hesitation to intervene forcefully in the market. It's the sound of doors closing slowly in comfortable buildings while the storm rages outside. It's the frustrating realization that the people who could potentially help are either unwilling, unable, or simply too slow to act effectively when you need them most. It's a stark contrast between the frantic, desperate struggle for life on the ground and the measured, deliberative pace of officialdom. And it leaves you and thousands like you increasingly reliant on your own diminishing reserves, the kindness of equally destitute strangers, or the bitter sustenance of the natural world. The bark bread, remember, that wasn't Plan A. That was the desperate measure born of the failure of Plan A, B, C, and the official Plan D, which never quite seemed to materialize in time. As winter grinds on and the trickle of official aid remains just that, a trickle, the crisis deepens. The focus will eventually shift from just getting food to dealing with the immense public health crisis brought on by starvation, migration, and overcrowding. But for now, in the early months of the declared famine, the main story is the disconnect between the suffering people and the struggling, slow-moving machinery of the state meant to protect them. It's a painful lesson in how quickly society can unravel when the fundamental safety nets are absent or fail. And you are living that lesson every single agonizing day. So you're out there, or maybe you've made it to a town seeking aid that hasn't quite arrived yet, and the rumblings of your stomach are becoming a constant, unbearable roar. All the traditional ways of coping have been exhausted. The stored grain is gone, the potatoes have failed the foraging for berries, and mushrooms is impossible under a blanket of snow, and those small, hopeful government allocations feel less like help and more like a cruel joke. It's at this point when desperation has settled deep in your bones, like the winter cold, that you turn to something truly fundamental, something that defines this specific period of suffering. Petu. Petu. The word itself sounds a little tough, doesn't it? And it is. It's not food in any sense you'd recognize from a cookbook, even a very old austere one. Petu is quite simply processed tree bark. It's the inner layer, the phloem of certain trees, most commonly pine, menti, and Finnish, but also sometimes spruce, kuusi, or even birch quavu if you're really desperate. This isn't like chewing on a twig for fun. This is scraping a living from the very structure of the forest itself. The process begins by finding a suitable tree. You can't just strip bark off any old tree anywhere. You need trees of a certain age and health, often younger ones, where the inner bark layer is more accessible and palatable. Though palatable is stretching the definition here to its absolute breaking point. You'd likely have to go deeper into the woods, perhaps venturing further than you normally would, because the easily accessible trees near villages would have been exploited first. It's a quiet, desperate hunt among the snow-laden evergreens, your breath misting in the frigid air. Armed with an axe or a sturdy knife, assuming you still possess such a tool and haven't traded it or had it stolen, you'd carefully make incisions in the bark. The goal isn't to kill the tree outright, though that was often an unfortunate side effect of extensive stripping, but to get to that thin greenish or yellowish layer just beneath the outer corky bark. It's the part of the tree that transports sugars produced during photosynthesis, so it contains some organic material, yes, and some carbohydrates, unlike the dead outer bark. But compared to grain, it's almost pure roughage and cellulose. Imagine trying to survive on sawdust and hope. Once you've stripped off pieces of this inner bark, often in long, narrow strips, the real work begins. This isn't something you just pop in your mouth. The raw inner bark is bitter tough and full of resins. It needs processing. The first step is usually drying. You take the strips home if you still had a home with a roof and lay them out by the fire or in a warm place to dry out. If you didn't have a functioning dwelling, you'd do it wherever you could find shelter, perhaps in a temporary camp, with others equally desperate. The smell of drying bark, probably mixed with the smells of wood smoke and unwashed bodies, would fill the air. Once dried, the bark becomes hard and brittle. You then need to process it further. The preferred method is grinding it into a powder or flour-like consistency. This requires millstones, or more likely, for a starving individual, simply pounding it repeatedly with heavy stones or a mortar and pestle if you were lucky enough to have one. The goal is to break down the tough fibers as much as possible. It's backbreaking, tedious work that yields a surprisingly small amount of usable material, a dusty brownish powder that looks nothing like the golden flour you remember from better years. Your hands would be chapped and sore, your arms aching from the effort. This bark flour, this petu, was rarely used on its own. It was simply too indigestible and offered too little energy. It needed to be mixed with whatever scant amount of real flour was left. Perhaps a handful of rye or oat flour, or maybe even flour ground from roots, mosses, or straw. Yes, straw. People would chop up straw, dry it, and try to grind it into something resembling flour just to add bulk. The ratio of petu to actual grain flour would increase as the famine wore on and grain became scarcer. Initially, it might have been just 10 to 20% bark. By the peak of the famine, it could be 50%, 70%, or even higher. This is a mainstream historical fact. Petu became a significant component of the diet for large parts of the population during the peak years of the famine. Once you had your mixture of petu and whatever else you could scrape together, you'd mix it with water and try to bake it into flatbreads or cook it like a porridge. The resulting bread was dense, heavy, dark brown or blackish, and incredibly coarse. It wasn't soft and fluffy. It was hard, often gritty, and difficult to chew and swallow. The taste was intensely bitter and resinous, with a lingering, unpleasant aftertaste. Imagine eating something that tasted vaguely of pine cleaner, mixed with dirt and disappointment. It required copious amounts of water to get down, and it sat in your stomach like a lead weight. And that weight was the main point. Petu provided bulk. It filled the stomach temporarily, creating a false sense of fullness that might quell the worst hunger pangs for a short while. But it provided very little actual nutritional value. It's mostly fiber that the human digestive system isn't equipped to process effectively. Trying to live on petu was like trying to power a car with gravel. It might fill the tank, but it won't make it run. The small amount of carbohydrates it did contain were hard to access and digest. And the mixing process with other meager ingredients meant the final product was deficient in proteins, fats, vitamins, and minerals. The health consequences of a diet dominated by petus were severe. Your body would still be starving even with a full stomach. The indigestible material would cause severe digestive distress, stomach pains, bloating, constipation, followed by debilitating diarrhea. The resins could be toxic in large quantities, further weakening an already compromised system. Your body would waste away muscles, atrophying, immune system collapsing. The temporary feeling of fullness offered by petu was a cruel trick, masking the fact that you were slowly starving to death from a lack of usable nutrients. A quirky tidbit about petu is that it wasn't entirely new to Finnish culture. In times of scarcity, poorer people had occasionally added small amounts of bark flour to bread as a filler, but this was rare and in much smaller proportions. The famine elevated petu from an occasional marginal additive to a primary staple food for large numbers of people, transforming it from a sign of poverty into a symbol of utter desperation. It was no longer bread with a little bark. It was bark with a little bread. Making and consuming petu was also incredibly labor-intensive, requiring energy that starving bodies barely had. You needed to walk through the snow to find trees hack at frozen bark, dry it, pound it, mix it, and bake it. All just for a few dense, bitter pieces of bread that would leave you feeling ill and still hungry for real food. It was a constant, exhausting cycle of work for minimal, detrimental return. Historians still argue whether the widespread reliance on Pet-2 prolonged life slightly by providing some bulk and minimal energy, or if it actually hastened death by causing debilitating digestive issues and preventing the consumption of potentially more nutritious, albeit scarce, wild plants or animal matter. There's no easy answer, and it likely varied greatly depending on the individual's initial health, the quality of the bark used, and what little else they could find to eat. It was a choice between immediate unbearable hunger and the slow, painful decline exacerbated by an indigestible, bitter pseudo-food. Not much of a choice, really. So as the winter wore on and the government's slow response meant little relief was reaching you, your days became a desperate, grim routine. You'd wake up cold and hungry if you had managed to sleep. You'd look for anything edible, maybe boiling some old bones for a thin broth, searching for frozen roots, or most likely preparing or consuming Pet-2. The smell of wood smoke mixed with the bitter aroma of baking bark bread would hang in the air of your makeshift shelter or village. It was the smell of survival, but also the smell of slow death. You'd chew on the gritty bread, feeling it scrape against your teeth and sit heavy in your stomach, knowing it wasn't enough, but knowing there was nothing else. It was a physical manifestation of the crisis, a constant bitter reminder of how far you had fallen, how utterly dependent you were on the harsh, unforgiving land and the insufficient efforts of man. The tree that had once provided shelter or wood for fire was now being consumed itself, a desperate symbol of an ecosystem and a society under immense strain. And with every tough, bitter bite, you were forced to confront the grim reality of survival at its most elemental and painful level. So you've chewed your way through another gritty piece of bark bread, feeling that familiar leaden weight settle in your stomach, a weight that screams full, while your cells whisper, betrayed. You survived the winter storms, you avoided freezing to death in the open, you haven't been driven entirely mad by the gnawing hunger, and you've managed to find enough Pet-2 and scraps to keep a flicker of life going. You might think the worst is over, that you faced the ultimate test and passed, but you'd be tragically, devastatingly wrong, because now a new enemy emerges, one that preys on your weakened state, an invisible foe that spreads like wildfire through the desperate, huddled masses. This is the era of disease the Grim Reaper's mop-up operation after starvation has done its preparatory work. Starvation doesn't just make you feel hungry, it systematically dismantles your body's defenses. Imagine your immune system as a castle wall. Constant, severe malnutrition is like having giant, slow-moving catapults relentlessly pounding away at those walls. Your white blood cells, your body's tiny defenders, aren't being produced in sufficient numbers or with enough vigor. Your gut, lining a crucial barrier against pathogens, becomes porous and weak. Your energy reserves are non-existent, meaning your body can't even mount a proper fever or inflammatory response to fight off invaders. You are in essence a walking, talking invitation for every nasty bug looking for a vulnerable host. And in the crowded, unsanitary conditions you likely find yourself in, maybe packed into a makeshift shelter with dozens of others, or huddled with fellow migrants by a roadside, or living in a village where the dead are hard to bury in the frozen ground, the bugs are absolutely everywhere having a field day. The list of unwelcome guests is grimly predictable for a famine of this scale. Typhus spread by lice becomes rampant. Imagine feeling feverish, weak, getting a rash, and experiencing delirium, all while your body's already ravaged by hunger. Typhus is the classic camp fever or jail fever. Wherever people are crowded together in poor conditions, it thrives. Then there's typhoid fever spread through contaminated food and water, leading to high fever, stomach pain, and often a characteristic rash. Dysentery, causing severe diarrhea, is another constant threat, dehydrating your already depleted body at an alarming rate. And let's not forget old favorites like smallpox, still a major killer in the 19th century, leaving survivors scarred and disfigured if they survived at all. In some areas, there were also outbreaks of cholera, another waterborne nightmare that leads to rapid, often fatal dehydration. It's like nature decided to throw the entire germ playbook at you just for good measure. The conditions of the famine were tailor-made for these diseases. People were migrating, carrying pathogens from village to village. They were gathering in relief centers or public buildings, creating perfect petri dishes for transmission. Sanitation collapsed. With bodies weak and resources scarce, maintaining hygiene became a near impossibility. Clean water was hard to come by, especially with the thaw turning everything into mud and potentially contaminating wells and streams with runoff from inadequate burials or human waste. The sheer cold forced people to huddle together for warmth, bringing them into close contact, ideal for the spread of airborne diseases or those carried by parasites like lice. It was a perfect storm of vulnerability, exposure, and lack of resources to combat the spread. You might have survived the hunger today, only to wake up tomorrow with the telltale aches and fever that signaled a much faster, more agonizing end. Think about the relentless cycle. You're weak from hunger, maybe struggling with indigestion from petua. You get typhus. The fever and delirium make it impossible to seek food or care for yourself. The disease uses up the last of your body's meager energy stores. If you survive typhus, you're left even weaker, more susceptible to dysentery, which then dehydrates you further. It's a spiral of decline, each illness building on the damage done by the last, with the underlying malnutrition ensuring your body has no reserves left to fight back effectively. A simple cold could be a death sentence, let alone something like smallpox. It's a grim joke you survived the famine itself, only to be finished off by a germ your healthy self could have shrugged off. A quirky tidbit about these epidemics is how specific local conditions could influence which disease was dominant. In areas where people were crowded, but perhaps had relatively better access to water, even if contaminated waterborne illnesses like typhoid and dysentery might be the primary killers. In migration routes and relief camps with extreme crowding and poor personal hygiene, typhus spread by body lice often reigned supreme. It wasn't a single plague, but a constellation of horrors, each finding its perfect niche in the landscape of human suffering created by the famine. It was like a grim competition among pathogens to see which one could claim the most lives. Fun times. The official response to the disease outbreaks was like the famine relief itself, slow and inadequate, hampered by the scale of the crisis, lack of resources, and limited medical understanding of the time. Doctors and medical personnel were overwhelmed, often falling sick themselves. Quarantines were attempted in some areas, but were difficult to enforce effectively among a desperate migrating population. Hospitals and infirmaries were quickly filled, often with multiple patients per bed, if beds were even available. The few medical supplies that existed were quickly exhausted. Most people sickened during the famine had little to no access to formal medical care, and were left to the inadequate nursing of equally weakened family members or neighbors, or simply died alone. This is a mainstream historical fact. The majority of deaths during the Great Finnish Famine of 1866-1868 were not caused directly by starvation, but by diseases that spread rapidly and proved fatal among a population severely weakened by malnutrition. While hunger was the underlying cause of vulnerability, the final blow for countless individuals came from typhus, typhoid, dysentery, smallpox, or other infectious diseases. Estimates vary, but many historians agree that 2/3 or even 3/4 of the famine-related deaths were due to these epidemics. Think about that. You might starve for months, your body wasting away, enduring the bitter peta bread, only to have a microscopic organism be the thing that ultimately kills you. It's a stark reminder of how interconnected health, nutrition, and environmental conditions are. The psychological toll of the epidemics was immense, adding another layer of horror to the already unbearable situation. Every cough, every fever, every bout of diarrhea became a source of terror. Watching family members sicken and die, knowing you could be next, unable to help them effectively, was soul-crushing. The sheer number of dead bodies overwhelmed communities. Digging graves in the frozen earth was incredibly difficult, leading to mass burials, or bodies being left unburied for periods, further contributing to the spread of disease when the thaw came. The constant presence of sickness and death created an atmosphere of pervasive dread. Historians still argue whether the government's public health measures, limited as they were, had any significant impact on the overall trajectory of the epidemics, or if the diseases simply ran their course as the population either died or developed some level of immunity, or as conditions slightly improved later. It's difficult to isolate the effect of specific interventions in the face of such overwhelming factors as mass malnutrition, crowding, and environmental contamination. What is clear is that the scale of the outbreaks far outstripped the capacity of the 19th century public health system to cope. It's also worth considering the social impact. Families were decimated not just by individual deaths from starvation, but by diseases that could sweep through an entire household. Children, the elderly, and the already frail were particularly vulnerable. Orphans were created in vast numbers, adding to the humanitarian crisis. The fear of contagion also led to people avoiding each other, breaking down the community support networks that might otherwise have helped individuals survive. If someone in a household showed symptoms, neighbors might refuse to help sealing their fate. It was a tragic irony that conditions forced people together, facilitating disease, while the disease itself then forced them apart through fear. Imagine the soundscape, the coughing, the groaning, the cries of the delirious, the chilling silence of death. Mixed with the constant rumbles of hungry stomachs and the biting wind, it was a symphony of suffering. You'd walk through a village or a relief camp, and the air would be thick with the smell of sickness and despair. There was no escaping it. You were either fighting hunger, fighting the cold, or fighting the germs, or often fighting all three simultaneously. The diseases didn't care if you were strong or weak, rich or poor, though the poor were certainly more exposed and vulnerable. Once they took hold in your weakened state, your chances were slim. So while the image of eating bark bread is iconic of the famine's desperation, the reality is that for most who perished, it wasn't the lack of food itself, but the cascading effects of that lack, the collapse of the body's defenses against the microbial world that delivered the final brutal blow. You might have endured the taste of petu and the ache in your belly only to be brought down by a fever and a rash, a cruel twist of fate, where survival of one ordeal simply ushered you into the path of another. It underscores the devastating totality of such a crisis, where every aspect of life becomes a potential threat, and the very air you breathe can carry your death warrant. It was a time when simply staying alive was a near impossible feat, and succumbing to illness was often just the final chapter of a long, agonizing struggle against an overwhelming, unforgiving reality. So you've somehow dodged the bullet of typhus or dysentery, maybe through sheer luck, maybe because you've managed to isolate yourself from the worst of the crowded conditions, which is becoming increasingly difficult, or maybe you simply haven't caught it yet, but the countryside is still a death trap. The fields are bare, the forests have yielded all they can, and the snow, even if it's melting now, isn't magically producing food. Staying put means almost certain starvation, or at least continued reliance on increasingly meager and unpalatable sources of nutrition, like your beloved petu. What do you do when your home offers nothing but a slow decline? You leave. You pack up whatever meager possessions you have left, maybe a pot, a blanket, a few tools if you're lucky, and you join the stream of people making their way towards anywhere they think might offer help. This is the era of migration, of desperate movement of hope clinging to rumor and distance. You hear stories whispered along the grapevine that still somehow functions even in this chaos. Stories of soup kitchens in the towns, of relief supplies being distributed by the government, or charities of work projects offering a pittance for backbreaking labor. Even if the stories are exaggerated, even if you know deep down the reality will be harsh, the pull is undeniable. It's better than sitting and waiting to die in your empty cottage. So you lock the door, or maybe just leave it swinging open, there's nothing left to steal anyway, and you set out. You might be alone, or you might be with the remnants of your family clutching onto each other for warmth and courage. The journey is arduous. Roads that were difficult in good times are now choked with mud from the spring thaw, or still treacherous with melting ice and snow. You walk for miles, your body weak from months of deprivation. Every step is an effort. You see others on the road, families pushing carts, individuals stumbling along, groups huddled together for rest. They're all heading in the same direction, drawn by the same desperate hope. The sights along the way are grim abandoned homes, the occasional unburied body by the roadside, skeletal figures moving like ghosts. There's a strange mix of shared misery and individual isolation. You're surrounded by people, but everyone is lost in their own struggle, their own hunger, their own fear. As you get closer to a town or known relief point, the crowds thicken. Villages along the route find themselves overwhelmed by the influx of people, their own limited resources quickly depleted. Tensions rise. The local population, struggling to survive themselves, often resent the migrants, seeing them as an extra burden, potential carriers of disease, or even beggars taking resources that should be theirs. Relief centers, when you finally reach one, are chaotic scenes. Long queues of gaunt figures stretch for blocks, waiting for a bowl of thin soup or a small piece of bread. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, sickness, and desperation. Shelter is scarce. People huddle in makeshift camps, abandoned buildings, or simply sleep outdoors exposed to the elements. This mass movement of people is a mainstream historical fact of the Great Finnish Famine. As conditions worsened, hundreds of thousands of people left their homes, particularly from the hardest-hit agricultural regions in the south and central parts of the country, migrating towards urban centers like Helsinki, Turku, and Tampere, or towards areas perceived to have more resources like the coast or parts of northern Finland. This internal migration put immense strain on the towns and villages they arrived in, overwhelming existing infrastructure and relief efforts. It also significantly contributed to the spread of the epidemics we just talked about, as people from different areas, potentially carrying different pathogens, congregated in crowded, unsanitary conditions. A quirky tidbit related to this migration is that some people, hearing rumors of better conditions or work opportunities, attempted to migrate even further afield, including trying to reach Sweden across the frozen Gulf of Bothnia. While the vast majority of migration was internal, the desperation was so profound that some entertained truly perilous journeys. Imagine trying to cross a frozen sea weakened by hunger on the rumor of a job. Talk about high-stakes travel plans. Your carry-on might just be a frozen potato and your last shred of hope. The sheer scale of this internal displacement was unprecedented in Finland at the time. Communities were hollowed out as significant portions of their population left. The social fabric frayed under the pressure. The traditional systems of support, neighbor helping neighbor, became impossible when everyone was starving. The act of migration itself was often a last resort, undertaken only when all other options had failed. It required a level of strength and determination that many simply didn't have left, making the journey itself incredibly risky. Many people died along the roads, their bodies discovered later when the snow melted. Historians still argue whether this mass migration exacerbated the famine conditions overall, or if it was a necessary, albeit desperate, survival strategy for individuals. On one hand, it overwhelmed urban centers and spread disease. On the other, staying put in a completely depleted rural area meant certain death for many. It's a complex question of individual survival versus collective well-being in a catastrophic situation. Did the benefit of potentially reaching aid outweigh the cost of spreading sickness and overwhelming resources elsewhere? There's no easy answer, just immense human tragedy. The relief efforts in the towns were often overwhelmed. The soup kitchens ran out of food, the few available shelters were packed beyond capacity, and the local authorities struggled to manage the influx. Work projects, often involving digging ditches or building roads in frozen ground, were organized to provide migrants with a way to earn some money or food. But the wages were low. The work was incredibly hard for weakened bodies, and the projects couldn't absorb everyone who needed help. You might stand in line for hours only to be turned away, or you might get a place on a work crew only to collapse from exhaustion or sickness after a few days. It was a constant struggle for survival, even when you reached a place that was supposed to offer aid. The psychological toll of the migration was also significant. The trauma of leaving home, the dangers of the journey, the shock of arriving in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions, and the constant uncertainty about where the next meal would come from, it all added to the immense mental burden. Families were separated, children lost parents, and the sense of displacement and loss was profound. You were a stranger in a strange, unwelcoming place, just one face among thousands of equally desperate faces. Any dignity you might have clung to back home was stripped away by the necessity of begging or relying on charity. Imagine the sounds of a relief camp, a low murmur of voices punctuated by coughs, cries of children, and the constant shuffle of feet. The smell would be overpowering. Unwashed bodies, wood smoke, damp earth, and the pervasive odor of sickness. The sight of so many suffering people gathered in one place would be horrifying. This wasn't just a personal struggle anymore. It was a visible collective breakdown of society, of order, of basic human dignity. You might find brief moments of camaraderie with others in the same boat, sharing stories or a scrap of warmth. But underlying it all was the fear and the competition for scarce resources. Even if you found a place to shelter, it was likely overcrowded and unsanitary, increasing your risk of contracting one of those rampant diseases. The food, if you got any, was meager and often unfamiliar. The work, if you found it, was backbreaking. And the feeling of being adrift, of having no home to return to, added to the despair. The journey itself, meant to be a path to survival, often simply led you to a different, perhaps faster way to die. It's like trading one nightmare for another, perhaps one with slightly less bark bread involved, but plenty of other unpleasantness to go around. So while the image of the starving peasant eating bark is powerful, the reality for many was the terrifying gamble of migration, the long walk to an uncertain future, and the descent into the chaos of overcrowded towns and relief centers where disease was as great a threat as hunger. You packed your few things, you walked until your feet bled, you queued for hours, and you faced the resentment of the locals and the indifference of an overwhelmed system. It was a testament to the depth of the crisis that so many were willing to undertake such a journey, driven by a primal instinct to survive, even when survival seemed like a distant, improbable dream. The roads of Finland during those years were paved with the footsteps of the desperate, a grim reminder of how far people will go when pushed to the absolute limit. So you've embarked on that desperate journey, perhaps reached a town, joined the endless queues, seen the crushing reality of overcrowded relief centers. While you're trying to survive hour by hour on the ground, navigating the mud, the disease and the gnawing hunger somewhere else in wood-paneled rooms far removed from the stench and suffering, there are other people. People in suits, people with titles, people who are supposed to be in charge. You might not think about them much as you huddle in a makeshift shelter, but their actions, their decisions, their failures to act are shaping the nightmare you're living through. This is where we look at the official response, the attempts from the top down to grapple with a catastrophe that was spiraling out of control. Finland in the 1860s wasn't a fully independent nation. It was the Grand Duchy of Finland, an autonomous part of the Russian Empire. This meant the highest levels of governance involved both Finnish officials, primarily the Finnish Senate in Helsinki, and the Russian authorities, including the Governor General appointed by the Tsar. Decision-making wasn't always swift or simple, and the bureaucracy, as you might expect from a 19th century administrative system, grappling with a crisis of this magnitude could be glacially slow. Imagine trying to get an urgent request for emergency grain, approved, debated, budgeted for, and then acted upon across multiple committees and potentially two different imperial administrations. It's less action plan and more glacial ballet. The initial response from the authorities was frankly hesitant and delayed. There were warnings in the autumn of 1866 after the devastating frost, but the full scale of the disaster wasn't immediately grasped, or perhaps wasn't politically convenient to acknowledge. When the reality became undeniable, the government did start to act. They formed committees, they held meetings, they sent out circulars. You know all the things you do when the sky is falling and people are eating tree bark. They authorized loans to municipalities to buy food, they tried to organize the importation of grain, and they encouraged the establishment of those public works projects like digging ditches and building roads to provide employment and a way for people to earn money to buy food. Food that was becoming increasingly scarce and expensive. One major challenge was simply procuring enough food. Finland was historically a net importer of grain, particularly rye in bad years. But 1867 was a bad year across much of Northern Europe, not just Finland. Harvests failed or were poor in Sweden, Norway, and parts of Russia. This meant global grain prices were high and finding available supply was difficult. Even when grain could be bought, transporting it was another hurdle. Ports were often frozen for months in the winter, and the internal transport network, especially outside the major centers, was poor. Moving large quantities of food to remote inland areas where the need was greatest was a logistical nightmare. Wagons got stuck in mud, horses died, and the sheer distances were vast. It's like trying to deliver pizza across a country that has mostly dirt roads and is currently covered in snow or thick mud. Not exactly same-day delivery material. The government did make efforts to import grain-securing loans and placing orders. Some ships arrived bringing much-needed rye and other foodstuffs primarily to the coastal cities. But the quantities were often insufficient to meet the overwhelming need, and distributing it effectively to the starving population across the country was a constant battle. Local officials who were supposed to oversee distribution and relief efforts were often overwhelmed, inexperienced, or even corrupt. There were stories of food supplies being misdirected, sold on the black market, or given preferentially to those with connections. While not universal, such instances added to the suffering and the public's distrust of the official response. Relief committees were established, often involving local gentry clergy and officials to try and manage the distribution of aid and organize local efforts. These committees faced immense pressure and impossible choices. How do you divide a small amount of food among thousands of starving people? Who gets help first? The elderly, the children, the workers. The decisions were agonizing, and often they simply didn't have enough to make a meaningful difference. The soup kitchens they set up, though providing brief respite, were often overwhelmed, serving thin gruel to endless lines of gaunt figures. The public work projects intended to provide a lifeline were also often inadequate. The pay too low or the work too strenuous for those weakened by hunger. A mainstream historical fact is that the Finnish Senate, facing the escalating crisis and realizing their own resources were insufficient, appealed for foreign aid. This was a significant step for the autonomous Grand Duchy. They sent representatives to various European countries pleading for assistance. This appeal met with a response from several nations, including Great Britain, Sweden, Germany, and France, as well as private individuals and organizations. Funds were raised and shipments of grain and other supplies were sent to Finland. This international solidarity provided some crucial resources and offered a glimmer of hope in the darkness. A quirky tidbit about the international aid effort is that in Britain, for instance, public appeals for donations were made, and the response was reportedly quite generous for the time. There were even accounts in British newspapers detailing the plight of the Finnish people, painting vivid and perhaps slightly exaggerated for dramatic effect pictures of the suffering, including the desperate practice of eating bark bread. This international media attention, though, perhaps fleeting, helped spur donations and put pressure on governments to offer assistance. Imagine reading about people eating trees in a faraway land over your morning tea and crumpets. It certainly puts your own problems in perspective, doesn't it? Despite these efforts, both domestic and international historians still argue whether the government response was fundamentally flawed due to inherent limitations of the era, or if it was simply too little too late. Some scholars emphasize the logistical hurdles, the lack of infrastructure, and the sheer scale of the harvest failure, arguing that no 19th century government could have fully prevented such a catastrophe. They point to the difficulties in importing and distributing food, the lack of modern medical knowledge to combat the epidemics, and the limited financial resources available. Others are more critical, arguing that the government was slow to recognize the severity of the crisis, that bureaucratic inertia hampered effective action, that there was insufficient urgency in securing adequate food supplies early on, and that coordination between different levels of administration and between the Finnish Senate and the Russian authorities was poor. Was it unavoidable catastrophe or administrative failure compounded by bad luck? It's a debate that continues to echo through the historical record, much like the persistent coughs in a famine relief camp. The government also struggled to control the spread of disease, which, as you know from Section 7 and 8, was a massive killer alongside starvation. While they issued some public health guidelines, sanitation in towns receiving migrants was often abysmal, and medical facilities were few and far between. They simply didn't have the understanding or the resources to contain the epidemics that were raging through the weakened population. Trying to stop typhus with 19th century medicine and sanitation practices is like trying to stop a flood with a teacup. It's a noble thought, but ultimately futile in the face of overwhelming force. The loans secured by the government and municipalities to buy food would have long-term consequences, plunging many areas into debt. The public work projects, while providing some immediate, albeit harsh relief, didn't build sustainable infrastructure that would prevent future famines. They were temporary fixes for a permanent problem. The overall impression looking back is one of a government overwhelmed by an unprecedented crisis, reacting slowly, hampered by bureaucracy, and limited resources and ultimately unable to prevent the horrific mortality that followed. They tried, yes, committees were formed, appeals were sent, ships were ordered, but the scale of the need simply dwarfed the scale of the response. Think about it from your perspective, the person living through this. You hear rumors of aid. Maybe you see a relief worker or a government official pass through your village or the camp you're staying in. You might queue for hours for a meager handout that doesn't even fill your stomach. You see the bureaucracy in action, the forms, the lists, the waiting. You see the limitations. The food runs out, the projects close down, the officials shrug overwhelmed. You feel the gap between the announced efforts and the grim reality on the ground. It breeds a deep sense of frustration and abandonment. The government, this distant entity you were taught to respect, feels powerless or indifferent in your hour of greatest need. Even the foreign aid, while symbolically important in providing some material relief, couldn't solve the fundamental problems of widespread crop failure, destroyed local economies, and inadequate infrastructure. It was a lifeline, but a thin and often frayed one. Ships arrived, the grain was unloaded, but getting it to the people who were literally starving in the depths of the countryside or the overcrowded, disease-ridden migrant camps was incredibly difficult and took valuable time. Time that many people simply didn't have. The international community offered a hand, but the bridge between that hand and your empty bowl was long and treacherous. So while the official history books list the decrees, the committees, the loans, and the appeals, the lived reality was often one of desperation persisting despite these efforts. The system built for normal times buckled and largely failed under the weight of the famine. It wasn't a complete lack of action, but the action taken was often too slow, too bureaucratic, too limited in scope, and too hampered by practical constraints to truly alleviate the suffering of the majority. The government was trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teacup, while also debating the best kind of wood for the teacup and forming a committee to study the properties of water. This period of the famine exposed fundamental weaknesses in Finland's infrastructure, administration, and economic structure. It showed that the country was too vulnerable to agricultural failure and too dependent on a single crop rye and traditional farming methods. It highlighted the need for better communication, better transport, and a more robust system of social welfare and emergency response. These lessons learned in the crucible of unimaginable suffering would eventually pave the way for reforms, but not before hundreds of thousands had perished. The government's response, in short, was a complex mix of earnest effort, crippling limitations, and undeniable failure to stem the tide of death. And you down there in the mud and the hunger felt every bit of that failure. You felt the inadequacy of the local and national response, the slow grind of bureaucracy, the heartbreaking reality that even the best intentions seem to crumble under the weight of the catastrophe. You've seen the committees meet the decrees issued, but the food still hasn't reached you, or it's a pittance when it does. But remember, back in Section 9, we touched on something slightly different. The idea that this wasn't just Finland's problem, or at least that others thought it wasn't just Finland's problem. This is where the outside world comes in, offering a hand, a lifeline across the frozen seas and the muddy roads. While the Finnish Senate was scrambling, securing loans, and trying to organize imports, they also made a crucial decision. They appealed for international aid. This wasn't a common thing for an autonomous region of the Russian Empire to do, but the situation was so dire, so utterly beyond their capacity to handle alone, that they swallowed whatever pride might have been involved and essentially put out a global distress signal. Messengers were sent, letters were drafted, pleas were made to foreign governments and benevolent organizations. Think of it as the 19th century equivalent of a viral social media campaign, but instead of cute cat videos, the content was graphic descriptions of starvation and death. This appeal for aid wasn't just a formality, it was a desperate gamble. Would anyone listen? Would anyone care enough to send help to a relatively poor, far-flung corner of Northern Europe, struggling under a famine that wasn't grabbing headlines, the way, say, a war or a major political upheaval might? The answer, perhaps surprisingly, was yes. The news of the Finnish famine did resonate in some parts of the world, particularly in countries with existing ties or a humanitarian impulse. The appeal went out to various European powers, and responses began to trickle in. Great Britain, a major maritime and economic power, was one of the first to respond significantly. Public appeals were launched there, championed by figures who had connections to Finland or simply felt moved by the reports of suffering. Newspapers carried accounts detailing the plight of the people, including descriptions that would have seemed utterly alien and shocking to a well-fed Victorian audience. Imagine sitting in your comfortable London drawing room sipping tea and reading about families eating boiled moss and ground bark. It must have felt like a dispatch from another planet, a planet where trees were considered food. Funds were collected through these public subscriptions, and the British government also contributed. Shipments of grain, flour, and other provisions were organized. These ships began the long and often perilous journey across the North Sea and Baltic, aiming for Finnish ports. Sweden, Finland's historical neighbor and former ruler, also responded with aid, as did countries like Germany and France. Even as far away as the United States reports spurred some efforts to collect funds, though the logistical challenges of sending aid across the Atlantic in those quantities at that time were immense. A mainstream historical fact here is that the international aid received particularly from Britain and Sweden consisted primarily of grain and money. While it didn't solve the famine, it was undeniably crucial in supplementing the meager domestic supplies and the limited government imports. Without this aid, the situation would have been even worse, if you can even imagine such a thing. The foreign shipments provided food for soup kitchens, helped sustain relief efforts in some areas, and perhaps most importantly, served as a psychological boost, a sign that Finland was not entirely alone in its suffering. The challenge, as with the government's own efforts, was getting this aid from the ports where it arrived to the starving people inland. The ships docked in Helsinki, Turku, or other coastal towns, but the famine was raging hardest in the interior, in the rural parishes where people had lost their crops and were isolated by distance and poor infrastructure. Unloading the grain was one thing. Transporting it hundreds of kilometers by horse-drawn wagon over primitive roads through deep snow or thick mud was another entirely. Rivers were frozen, roads impassable, and the logistics were a nightmare. It's like ordering vital supplies online, but the delivery service is a single donkey named Bartholomew who gets easily distracted by interesting-looking pebbles. Sometimes the aid arrived too late for those who were already severely weakened. Sometimes it couldn't reach the most remote areas at all. Sometimes it was distributed unevenly or got caught up in local conflicts or inefficiencies. While the intent behind the international aid was pure, the execution was messy, difficult, and frustratingly slow from your perspective on the ground. You might hear rumors that a ship has arrived in Helsinki carrying food from England. You might wait weeks, months, even before any of that food reaches your village, if it ever does. By then, several of your neighbors might be gone. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that among the private donations collected in Britain, there were reports of specific items being sent that perhaps weren't the most practical for a famine relief effort in rural Finland. While grain was the priority, some well-meaning individuals apparently included items like clothing, which was needed, but perhaps not fancy hats or even books, presumably not high on the list of needs for someone starving. It highlights the gap between the empathy of the donors and the grim reality of the recipients. Imagine being handed a copy of Pride and Prejudice when all you want is a loaf of bread. Oh, how dashing Mr. Darcy is. Could he possibly procure us some rye? Despite the challenges, the aid did make a difference in many places. Relief committees, often supported by foreign funds and supplies, were able to keep some people alive through the worst periods. The sight of carts arriving with sacks of grain bearing foreign markings must have been a powerful one, a flicker of hope in a landscape of despair. It showed that humanity in its better moments could extend a hand across borders in times of extreme need. However, historians still argue whether the international aid was primarily a humanitarian gesture or partly motivated by political considerations. While the immediate impetus was clearly charitable, some scholars suggest that larger geopolitical factors might have played a subtle role. For instance, demonstrating goodwill towards the Grand Duchy of Finland might have been seen by some powers like Britain as a way to subtly needle Russia, which wasn't always on the best terms with other European nations. Or perhaps it was simply the standard practice of mutual aid among European states facing natural disasters, a form of international solidarity that transcended immediate political rivalries. Was it pure altruism, or was there an element of statecraft involved? It's a question that doesn't diminish the suffering alleviated, but adds a layer of complexity to the motivations. From your perspective, the source of the food didn't matter as much as the fact that it was food. Whether it came from Helsinki, London, or Stockholm, A bowl of thin gruel was a bowl of thin gruel, and it might mean the difference between another day of life and the end of your struggle. You might see aid workers, some perhaps even speaking with foreign accents, trying their best to manage the chaos, distribute supplies, and perhaps even offer rudimentary medical help. Though again, 19th century medicine was limited against epidemics. Their efforts were often heroic, but they were fighting a losing battle against overwhelming forces of starvation, disease, and logistical collapse. The international response, while significant and undoubtedly life-saving for some, was ultimately insufficient to stem the tide of death. The scale of the famine was simply too vast, the infrastructure too poor, and the available resources, both domestic and foreign, too limited. It was like pouring a bucket of water on a raging forest fire. It might save a few trees on the edge, but the core blaze continues unabated. The aid helped, it truly did, but it couldn't fill the hundreds of thousands of empty stomachs, couldn't cure the typhus that was ripping through the migrant camps, couldn't bring back the failed harvests. The experience of receiving international aid also highlighted Finland's precarious position. Dependent on imports, even in good years, the famine exposed the country's vulnerability to global grain markets and the disruptions of trade. It underscored the need for greater food security and diversification of the economy, lessons that would be slowly absorbed in the following decades. It also perhaps fostered a sense of connection to the wider world, showing that Finland was not completely isolated despite its location and political status. You saw the ships arrive, heard the rumors of generous donations, perhaps even received a handout of foreign grain. But you also saw the lines grow longer. The sickness spread faster, the faces of your friends and family grow thinner. The aid was a band-aid on a gaping wound. Necessary, appreciated, but ultimately unable to stop the bleeding entirely. It represented a moment of shared humanity across borders, a noble effort. But it also starkly illustrated the limitations of such efforts in the face of a truly catastrophic systemic failure, like the Great Finnish Famine. You ate the foreign grain, felt its temporary relief, and then the hunger returned, a relentless reminder that even the kindness of strangers couldn't fully erase the reality of your situation. You felt the hope flicker with the arrival of aid, however limited and frustratingly slow it was to arrive, didn't you? You saw the sacks of grain, heard the whispers of charity from across the sea. But as people gathered where aid might be in relief centers or near the few places where supplies could be distributed, another silent enemy thrived. Starvation is a slow, cruel killer, stripping the body of its defenses, leaving you weak, vulnerable. But what truly swept through the population like a scythe, often finishing what hunger started, was disease. Imagine your body already running on empty, subsisting on ground bark, and hope, which sadly contains 0 calories. Your immune system, usually your personal bodyguard service, has essentially gone on strike due to lack of funding. It's saying, look, mate, we can barely keep the lights on in here, let alone fight off invaders. So when pathogens come knocking, they find the door wide open, maybe even a welcome mat out. The most notorious killer during the famine years, the one that would haunt the collective memory, was typhus. This isn't the kind of thing you get from a mosquito. This is the stuff spread by body lice. Yes, those tiny, persistent creatures that in times of widespread poverty and lack of hygiene become tragically common. When people are crammed together, desperate for warmth, and any scrap of food washing becomes a luxury, and lice, well, they have a field day. They move from person to person carrying the bacteria, Rickettsia prowazekii, like microscopic villains in a tiny, itchy invasion force. The symptoms of typhus were horrific, especially for a body already on the brink. High fever, often spiking to dangerous levels, racking chills, a terrible headache, and a rash that starts on the trunk and spreads. People would become delirious, their eyes glassy and distant. There was profound weakness, muscle aches, and often a hacking cough. In a famine environment, these symptoms were often a death sentence. Your body simply didn't have the reserves to fight it off. It's like trying to run a marathon when you haven't eaten in 3 days. You're just not equipped for the challenge. Relief centers intended to save lives sometimes inadvertently became breeding grounds for disease. People would flock to towns or distribution points seeking food shelter or medical help. They would gather in crowded barns, temporary shelters, or even just huddle together in public buildings. These were perfect conditions for lice to jump from person to person. One person with typhus could quickly infect dozens of others in such close quarters. It was a tragic irony. The very act of seeking help could expose you to the deadliest threat. You might finally find a place offering a bowl of thin gruel, only to contract the fever that would take you within days. Typhus wasn't the only disease on the rampage, of course. Dysentery causing severe diarrhea and dehydration was rampant, particularly where water sources became contaminated. Smallpox, though somewhat controlled by vaccination programs, still flared up in weakened populations. Measles and other childhood diseases also proved far more fatal to malnourished children. It was a grim parade of pestilence, each illness finding easy victims among the starving. Imagine trying to recover from a bout of severe dehydration when you can barely find clean water and have nothing but bark mush in your stomach. It's a nightmare scenario, and it was the daily reality for hundreds of thousands. The scale of the mortality from disease was staggering. While estimates vary, something we'll touch on later, it's widely accepted that disease, particularly typhus, was responsible for more deaths than starvation itself. Starvation weakened you, but disease delivered the final blow. It preyed on the young, the old, and anyone whose body was simply too worn down to resist. The sight of entire families succumbing first to hunger, then to fever was heartbreakingly common. You might see a neighbor shivering uncontrollably, their skin clammy, their eyes unfocused, and you knew with a sickening certainty what was happening. There was little you could do but watch and hope it didn't come for your family next. The authorities, overwhelmed by the scale of the famine, struggled to cope with the epidemics. Public health measures in the 1860s were rudimentary at best. Understanding of disease transmission was still developing. The germ theory was gaining ground, but wasn't universally accepted or translated into effective public health policy everywhere. While some efforts were made to establish isolation wards or provide basic medical care, they were utterly inadequate for the crisis. Imagine doctors with limited supplies trying to treat thousands of feverish patients in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions, armed with little more than hope and some questionable remedies. It's less like a hospital and more like a scene from a very grim, very underfunded play. A mainstream historical fact is that the 1867-1868 famine period saw a dramatic increase in mortality rates, with the death toll reaching levels unseen in peacetime Finland. Estimates suggest that close to 8% of the total population perished, a proportion comparable to some of Europe's worst famines in earlier centuries. And a significant majority of these deaths were attributed to infectious diseases, with typhus leading the charge, often following closely on the heels of severe malnutrition. This wasn't just a few isolated cases. This was a national catastrophe where sickness and death became terrifyingly commonplace. The sheer number of excess deaths recorded during those years paints a stark picture of the twin horrors of hunger and disease. From your perspective, the signs of sickness were everywhere. The hacking coughs echoing in the cold air, the telltale rash, the vacant stare of fever. You learned to recognize the symptoms, and a chill unrelated to the weather would go down your spine. Perhaps you tried traditional remedies, poultices of herbs or prayers, but they rarely worked against the relentless march of typhus. You might try to keep yourself and your family clean, but in a world where water was scarce, soap a luxury, and everyone was living cheek by jowl, it felt like trying to hold back a flood with a colander. It was a losing battle against an invisible enemy carried by tiny bugs. One quirky or fringe tidbit related to this period is the varying understanding and attempts to combat lice and typhus. While the link between lice and typhus was not fully understood by everyone at the time, that detailed scientific connection would come later. People certainly knew that lice were a problem and associated with sickness and poverty. There were folk remedies and practices aimed at getting rid of lice, often involving harsh substances or rigorous, though perhaps ineffective cleaning rituals. Some might shave heads completely, not for fashion, but in a desperate attempt to remove every last hiding place. Imagine sitting there freezing while someone shaves your head with rusty shears, praying it will keep the fever away. It highlights the limited knowledge and desperate measures people resorted to. It's a far cry from your modern delousing shampoo, isn't it? The psychological toll of witnessing so much sickness and death was immense. Beyond your own suffering and hunger, you saw your community decimated. People you had known your whole life, vibrant and strong, reduced to feverish shadows and then gone. Funerals became a daily occurrence, sometimes multiple times a day. The ground was often frozen, making burial difficult, adding another layer of grimness to the process. The sheer number of dead meant traditional burial practices were sometimes abandoned. leading to mass graves, a stark and tragic symbol of the scale of the loss. It was a constant reminder that death was always close a companion in the cold, hungry nights. As if typhus wasn't enough, the cold weather itself contributed to sickness. People huddled together for warmth, further facilitating the spread of airborne illnesses like influenza and pneumonia, which were particularly deadly to those with weakened lungs and systems. The combination of malnutrition, cold, and infectious disease created a perfect storm of mortality. It wasn't just one thing killing people, it was a confluence of disasters hitting a population with zero resilience left. It's like stacking every negative modifier possible in a video game. Damage taken X10 in health regeneration, 500% defense, 90%. You didn't stand a chance. The response both from the government and relief organizations was hampered by the sheer speed and spread of the epidemics. By the time measures were put in place, the diseases were already everywhere. Doctors and medical personnel were overwhelmed, often falling ill themselves. Supplies of medicines, even the limited ones available then, were scarce. The logistical nightmare of transporting food was mirrored in the difficulty of transporting medical aid or setting up effective isolation facilities in remote areas. The infrastructure simply couldn't handle the crisis. Historians still argue whether it was the direct effects of starvation or the diseases it enabled that was the primary driver of mortality. While typhus is often cited as the biggest killer, the argument is made that without the precursor of severe malnutrition, the death toll from disease would have been far lower. The body's ability to fight off infection is directly linked to its nutritional status. So was it death by hunger or death by opportunistic infection? The lines blur considerably. Did someone die from typhus, or did they die because starvation made them unable to survive typhus? It's a complex question with no simple answer, and scholars continue to pore over the limited records to try and understand the precise dynamics of the mortality during this horrific period. The long-term consequences of this wave of sickness went beyond the immediate deaths. Survivors were often left with chronic health problems. The psychological scars of witnessing such devastation would last a lifetime. Communities were broken apart, families decimated. The loss of so many working-age adults also had a devastating impact on the ability of communities to recover and rebuild in the years that followed. It wasn't just a temporary dip in population. It was a demographic shockwave that reshaped the country. You survived perhaps through sheer luck, perhaps because you managed to stay in a slightly less affected area, perhaps because you had a slightly stronger constitution to begin with. But you watched others fall sick, heard their labored breathing, saw the fear in their eyes. You saw the sickness sweep through villages, leaving behind empty houses and mourning survivors. The typhus tide was a grim, unforgettable chapter of the famine, a reminder that sometimes the smallest creatures invisible to the naked eye can be the most devastating force of all, especially when humanity has been weakened to its core. You carry the memory of those fevered faces, the whispered prayers, and the awful silence that fell over places where sickness had done its worst. You've survived the sickness, you've watched others succumb. You carry the weight of those memories. In the face of such widespread suffering, you might have started to wonder, where was the help? Where were the people who were supposed to be in charge? Surely they saw what was happening. Surely they were doing something while they were in their way. The response from the authorities, the Grand Duchy of Finland's government under the Russian Empire, was a complex, often frustrating mix of limited resources, bureaucratic inertia, and genuine, though sometimes ineffective efforts. At first, the scale of the crisis wasn't fully grasped by those in power, particularly those further removed from the suffering northern and eastern regions. News traveled slowly in the 1860s. Telegraph lines existed, but they weren't everywhere, and official reports lagged behind the grim reality you were living. It's like trying to understand a wildfire by only reading tweets from 3 towns over. You get snippets, but not the full terrifying scope until it's licking at your own doorstep. When the severity of the famine became undeniable, the government did begin to act, but it was often a case of too little, too late. Their primary focus was on procuring grain. Remember how you were yearning for just a handful of rye? The government knew that providing food was paramount, but buying grain on the international market was expensive, and Finland wasn't a wealthy place. The government took out loans both domestically and internationally, borrowing heavily to purchase grain from abroad. This was a significant undertaking, incurring substantial debt that would burden the Grand Duchy for years. Imagine the officials in Helsinki poring over ledgers trying to figure out how to buy enough food for a starving nation with a practically empty treasury. It was a daunting task made harder by competing demands and limited credit. The purchased grain then had to be transported, and this is where the logistical nightmare truly unfolded. Finland's infrastructure in the 1860s was not designed for moving vast quantities of bulk goods across long distances quickly, especially in winter. Roads were poor, railways were few, remember the line under construction, and waterways were frozen for much of the crucial period. Getting grain from the ports where it arrived to the remote inland areas where people were starving was an immense challenge. It's like trying to deliver pizzas across a frozen, roadless wilderness using only sleighs and maybe a really determined reindeer. Slow, arduous, and susceptible to all sorts of delays. You might hear rumors of a grain shipment arriving in a nearby town only for days or weeks to pass before any of it actually made it to your village, if it ever did. The wagons would get stuck in snowdrifts, rivers remained impassable, and the sheer scale of the need overwhelmed the available transport. Often the grain would arrive in a district capital, and then it was up to local authorities who were themselves struggling to figure out how to distribute it further. This led to bottlenecks, spoilage, and sometimes tragically grain sitting in warehouses while people starved just miles away. You might stand by the side of a frozen track, watching hopefully for a cart, feeling a mix of desperation and weary cynicism about whether it would ever appear. The distribution system itself was fraught with difficulties. Relief committees were set up at various levels, regional, local. Their job was to assess need register families and hand out the meager rations. But these committees were often staffed by local officials or volunteers who were themselves affected by the famine or lacked the experience and resources to manage such a crisis effectively. Imagine your village elder, a respected but perhaps not exactly an expert logistician, suddenly in charge of deciding who gets how much grain and trying to keep order among hundreds of starving, desperate people. It was a recipe for chaos and sometimes unfairness. Stories circulated, whispers passed from village to village about favoritism or even corruption. While many officials did their best under impossible circumstances, the temptation was certainly there. When there isn't enough to go around, difficult choices have to be made, and those with connections or local influence might find themselves slightly better off. You might see someone who seemed less desperately thin than you receiving a ration, and a bitter knot would form in your stomach. Was it fair? Was it necessary? You didn't know for sure, but the suspicion was always present. Beyond food, the government attempted to organize work relief programs. The idea was that people would work on public projects like building roads or railways in exchange for food or money. This was intended to provide an income and keep people from simply waiting for charity, maintaining some semblance of dignity. It was a common approach to famine relief at the time. You might have trudged miles through the snow to a work site, hoping to earn a few scraps of bread or a small wage. But these programs had their own problems. The work was often incredibly arduous, demanding physical strength that starving bodies simply didn't possess. People would collapse from exhaustion or sickness on the job. The wages or food provided were often insufficient to feed a family. And the harsh conditions, the cold, the inadequate food made these work camps potential death traps, especially with disease rampant. You might have seen the gaunt figures chipping away at frozen earth, knowing they were spending their last reserves of energy just to survive another day. Let's talk about international aid. The plight of Finland, part of the Russian Empire, but with its own distinct identity, did attract some attention abroad. Appeals were made particularly in Sweden and Great Britain, which had historical and economic ties to Finland. Relief committees were formed in these countries and money and supplies were collected. This was early international humanitarianism in action, a glimmer of cross-border empathy in a tough world. You heard the rumors? They say the English are sending help, or money from Sweden is coming. Ships carrying grain, flour, and other supplies did set sail for Finland. This international aid was incredibly important, not just for the tangible supplies it brought, but also as a morale booster. It was a sign that the world hadn't completely forgotten you. The arrival of a ship loaded with grain purchased by foreign donations would be met with a wave of desperate hope. Imagine the scene at a port, the shivering crowds watching as sacks were unloaded, the air thick with anticipation and the smell of foreign grain. However, the amount of international aid, while generous in intent, was relatively small compared to the overall need. It supplemented the government's efforts, but it couldn't replace them. And it faced the same logistical challenges. Getting the aid from the coastal cities to the starving interior was a monumental task. Some aid was specifically directed to certain areas or groups like orphans, adding another layer of complexity to the distribution. Historians still argue whether the foreign aid was truly significant in terms of saving lives on a national scale, or if its main impact was localized and symbolic. It certainly helped to some people, but it wasn't a magic bullet that ended the famine. A mainstream historical fact here is the sheer financial strain the famine placed on the Grand Duchy of Finland's government. They borrowed millions of Finnish marks and other currencies to purchase grain. The total cost of relief efforts, including food purchases, transport, and work programs, was enormous, far exceeding the government's ordinary budget. This debt became a major issue for Finland's finances for years afterward, impacting other areas of public spending. It wasn't just a humanitarian crisis. It was an economic one that crippled the state's finances, forcing difficult choices about future investments and development. It's like taking out a massive mortgage just to buy groceries. You survive the week, but you're paying for it for decades. The coordination between the central government, local authorities, and foreign aid organizations was often difficult. Communication was slow, roles were unclear, and there was no single highly efficient famine relief agency like you might see today. It was a fragmented effort with different groups doing their best, but often working in isolation or even at cross purposes. You might hear conflicting instructions or be told aid was available in one place, only to find out it had already been distributed elsewhere. One quirky or fringe tidbit from this period relates to the nature of some of the foreign aid. While grain was paramount, other items were sometimes sent. Stories mention shipments of things like potatoes, peas, and even clothes. While practical, imagine receiving a crate of, say, second-hand top hats from London relief societies. Unlikely but possible. More realistically, some aid included things like seed grain intended to help farmers plant the next crop, which was a forward-thinking approach. But distributing seed grain to starving people who were desperate for food now posed its own challenges. Did you eat the seed and survive today, or plant it and hope for a harvest next year? It was a terrible gamble to ask people to make. It highlights the disconnect between well-meaning donors far away and the brutal immediate reality on the ground. The overall effectiveness of the official response is something historians still debate. Some argue that the government did the best it could under incredibly difficult circumstances, facing an unprecedented crisis with limited resources and infrastructure. They point to the massive loans taken out in the efforts, however flawed, to procure and distribute food. Others are more critical, suggesting the response was too slow, too bureaucratic, and that more lives could have been saved with quicker, more decisive action, particularly in the early stages of the famine before it reached its peak. From your perspective, the official response felt distant, inadequate, and often infuriatingly slow. You saw the effects of the aid, the occasional distribution of grain, the hope that flickered when a work project opened up. But you also saw the lines of desperate people, the empty storehouses, the aid that arrived too late for your neighbor. You understood in a visceral way the difference between official pronouncements and the grinding reality of hunger and cold. The reports might say aid was being distributed, but that didn't fill your empty stomach right now. The actions of the government and international donors, while imperfect, did undeniably save some lives and laid the groundwork for eventual recovery. The grain they purchased, however, delayed in arrival, provided vital sustenance to hundreds of thousands. The work programs, despite their harshness, kept some people going and contributed to building infrastructure that would benefit the country later. The foreign aid, while limited, was a lifeline for certain communities and a symbol of hope. It wasn't a failure, but it was far from a complete success, overshadowed by the sheer magnitude of the disaster. You saw the relief efforts as another part of the struggle, a new variable in the equation of survival, sometimes helping, sometimes frustrating, never quite enough to erase the gnawing pain in your belly or the fear in your heart. You learned that help, even when it came, was often conditional, slow, and rarely arrived without its own set of problems. It was just another facet of the brutal reality you were navigating day by day. The silence of the snow, which seemed merely stark and empty in the autumn, now takes on a more sinister quality. It's not just a blanket over the landscape. It feels like a lid sealing in the cold and sealing out any hope. The short, weak days offer little warmth, and the nights stretch on long and brutal. You wake up not refreshed, but aching the cold, having seeped deep into your bones while you slept huddled under inadequate blankets. The first thing you notice is the persistent gnawing emptiness in your stomach. It was there yesterday and the day before, but now it's intensifying, demanding attention, making it hard to focus on anything else. The food reserves you did manage to gather, the few root vegetables that survived the frost, the tiny amount of grain threshed from the stunted stalks, are dwindling at an alarming rate. You portion them out with agonizing care, stretching each meager serving as far as possible. Every crumb is precious. You find yourself constantly calculating, counting the days until the next inevitably smaller portion. The taste of food, even the simplest, blandest porridge made from whatever scraps are left, becomes an intense experience, savored for its fleeting presence before the hunger returns. This isn't just skipping a meal, it's facing the real prospect of nothing. As the winter deepens, the options shrink. Fuel for heating is scarce. Trees are felled, but even that requires energy you don't have. The houses, poorly insulated by modern standards, struggle to retain any heat. You spend your days trying to stay warm, trying not to think about the cold outside or the emptiness inside. The cheerful bustling of a normal winter, preparing for holidays, visiting neighbors, is absent. There's a grim, quiet desperation hanging in the air, heavier than the falling snow. This is when the hard choices become unavoidable. That seed grain you saved the hope for next year. It's staring at you from its sack, promising survival now at the cost of the future. For many, the hunger wins. They eat the seed grain, a desperate gamble, buying a few more days or weeks, but mortgaging their ability to plant when spring finally arrives. It's a heartbreaking decision, sacrificing the future for the present, but the present's demands are overwhelming. Imagine eating your retirement fund just to buy groceries this week. It's that level of irreversible desperation. Livestock, if you still have any, becomes a liability. They need feeding too, and their food is gone. You can try to slaughter them for meat, but a single animal, if it's even healthy enough to eat, provides only temporary relief and eliminates a potential future resource: milk, eggs, wool, or draft power. Or you can try to sell them, but with everyone in the same boat, the market is flooded and prices plummet. Selling a cow for pennies is a bitter pill, but sometimes the only way to get a tiny bit of cash to try and buy food elsewhere. This leads to the second major development of this terrible winter movement. People start leaving their homes. Not because they want to, but because they see no other choice. They hear rumors, whispers carried on the wind of places where there might still be food, where relief efforts are being organized, where the government might be doing something. These rumors are often vague, unreliable, and desperately clung to. You decide, or your neighbors decide, that staying put is a death sentence. The only chance is to go somewhere else. So you gather the few possessions you can carry, a thin blanket, a pot, whatever meager food remains, and you set out. The destinations are varied: larger towns or cities like Helsinki, Turku, or Tampere, perceived centers of wealth and authority. Other regions rumored to have slightly better harvests. Locations where the government might be setting up soup kitchens or distributing aid. These journeys are incredibly arduous. Travel in winter Finland in the 1860s was already challenging, even with resources. Doing it starving, freezing, and often on foot is almost unimaginable. You trudge through deep snow, along frozen roads, or across frozen lakes and rivers. The cold bites at any exposed skin. Your thin clothes offer little protection. The journey itself is dangerous. You could get lost, succumb to the cold, or simply collapse from exhaustion and hunger. It's not a pleasant walk in the winter wonderland. It's a desperate flight from death, often leading only to death on the road. Families travel together, or individuals striking out alone, each step a monumental effort. This mass movement of people fleeing starvation is a defining tragic feature of the famine. It's estimated that hundreds of thousands of people were on the move during the worst periods of the crisis. They became internal refugees, clogging roads, arriving in towns that were ill-equipped to handle them. It was a visual manifestation of the crisis impossible to ignore, even for those further away. The sheer scale of this migration was historically significant. a clear signal of societal breakdown under extreme duress. That's your mainstream historical fact. The winter of 1866-1867 saw widespread internal migration within Finland, as people fled starvation in rural areas converging on towns and perceived centers of aid. As these hungry, desperate people arrived in towns and cities, they presented a new problem. Local authorities were overwhelmed. They had limited food supplies themselves, limited funds, and no infrastructure for housing or feeding thousands of displaced individuals. The situation quickly deteriorated into a humanitarian crisis in the urban centers as well, with starvation and disease spreading rapidly among the crowded, weakened migrants. Imagine your small town suddenly having its population double or triple overnight, with everyone arriving freezing and starving. It's a logistical nightmare on a scale that would challenge modern resources, let alone those of the 19th century. Meanwhile, the government's response was initially slow and inadequate. Finland at this time was the Grand Duchy of Finland, an autonomous part of the Russian Empire. The administration was centered in Helsinki, reporting ultimately to the Tsar in St. Petersburg. Information traveled slowly. The scale of the harvest failure in the autumn of 1866 wasn't immediately understood in its entirety by the central authorities. Initial reports might have been dismissed or downplayed. There was also a degree of bureaucratic inertia, and perhaps a lack of urgency or full comprehension of the depth of the crisis. Historians still argue whether the slowness of the government response was primarily due to genuine ignorance of the situation's severity in the early stages, bureaucratic inefficiency inherent in the administrative structure, or a political unwillingness to expend significant resources on a crisis perceived perhaps as geographically distant or confined. There was certainly a learning curve involved. No one in the administration had experience handling a famine of this magnitude. It wasn't like they had a pre-written famine response playbook tucked away somewhere. The government did eventually begin to act, but the initial measures were insufficient to meet the scale of the need. Early actions might have included ordering limited grain imports, setting up some public works projects to provide jobs and wages, which people could then use to buy food if any was available, or attempting to organize local relief committees. But these efforts were hampered by the lack of infrastructure. Railways were sparse, roads were poor, especially in winter, and communication was slow. Getting grain from the coast or from Russia inland to the hardest hit areas was a monumental task, often taking weeks or months. There was also a disconnect between the central administration and the reality on the ground in remote villages. Reports from local priests, teachers, or officials about the worsening conditions might get bogged down in bureaucracy or not reach the highest levels with the necessary urgency. It's a bit like trying to manage a massive complex disaster today using only carrier pigeons and handwritten memos. Progress was measured in weeks and months, not hours. A quirky tidbit from this period highlights the desperation and the disconnect. There are accounts of people trying to travel towards the St. Petersburg itself, believing the Tsar's capital must surely have food, or that the Tsar himself would personally provide for them if only they could reach him. This belief, naive as it might seem, underscores the lack of faith in local or regional authorities and the almost mythical status of the distant central power. Imagine deciding your best bet for dinner is to walk to the capital city of a neighboring country because you heard they have soup. It speaks volumes about how dire things were at home. The limited funds available for relief were another major constraint. The Grand Duchy's budget was finite, and there were competing demands. Raising taxes in a time of economic collapse was difficult. Borrowing money took time and negotiation. So the resources allocated for famine relief were initially a fraction of what was needed, like trying to put out a forest fire with a teacup. The public works projects, while a sensible idea in principle providing income so people could buy food, were often poorly planned for the winter conditions and the physical state of the starving workforce. Trying to dig canals or build roads in freezing temperatures with people suffering from malnutrition was inherently inefficient and dangerous. Many who attempted this labor simply collapsed or died on the job. It wasn't exactly a come work for us, enjoy hot meals kind of setup. More like come swing a pickaxe on an empty stomach in a blizzard and maybe we'll give you a voucher. As winter dragged on through late 1866 and into early 1867, the situation became truly catastrophic. The initial deaths were from starvation and cold, But as people weakened and congregated in makeshift shelters or overwhelmed town facilities, disease began to spread rapidly. Typhus, dysentery, smallpox. These opportunistic infections found easy victims among the malnourished population. The death rate began to climb steeply, turning a food crisis into a mortality crisis. The sight of starving people in the streets, the growing number of deaths, the increasing chaos in towns, this undeniable reality finally began to force a more significant government response, but it was agonizingly slow to ramp up. The wheels of bureaucracy turned glacially at the best of times. In a crisis of this scale, they seem almost frozen solid, much like the landscape outside. You shivering in your thin clothing, watching neighbors pack up their meager belongings to head out into the deadly snow. Feel a mixture of fear, despair, and perhaps a flicker of desperate hope that somewhere out there is better. Maybe those rumors are true. Maybe help is coming. But mostly you feel the cold, the hunger, and the terrible uncertainty of a winter that promises only escalating misery. The decision to stay or to go is a matter of life and death, with no guarantee that either choice is the right one. The calendar pages turn, but the new year of 1867 brings no relief. January melts into February, then March, and the grip of winter only tightens. The cold is no longer just uncomfortable, it's a constant draining enemy. Every breath you take feels like swallowing ice shards. The thin walls of your shelter offer little protection against the biting winds that howl across the frozen landscape. Inside, it's barely warmer than outside, and your body spends precious, irreplaceable energy just trying to maintain its core temperature. The hunger has moved beyond a gnawing ache. It's a relentless, consuming void that dominates your every thought. Your body is wasting away. Muscles are shrinking, fat reserves are long gone, and your skin hangs loosely on your bones. You move slowly, every action requiring a conscious effort. Even simple tasks like standing up or walking a short distance feel like climbing a mountain. The world narrows to the immediate, desperate need for food and warmth. If you were one of the thousands who decided to leave your home, you are now likely either huddled in an overcrowded, unsanitary temporary shelter in a town, or still on the road pushing through the snow. The towns that people flocked to were quickly overwhelmed. There was no infrastructure for this kind of internal refugee crisis. Churches, barns, public buildings, anything with a roof became a makeshift dormitory crammed with starving, freezing people. Privacy, hygiene, basic sanitation. These concepts became meaningless luxuries. It was a recipe for disaster, and disaster arrived not just as hunger, but as disease. This is where the second equally deadly wave of the famine strikes epidemic disease. Starvation weakens the body's defenses, making it a perfect host for infections. The crowded, unsanitary conditions in shelters and along migration routes provided fertile ground for rapid transmission. Typhus, often called famine fever or camp fever in historical accounts, became rampant. It spread by lice, which thrived in the cramped, unwashed conditions. Dysentery, tuberculosis, smallpox, measles. These diseases tore through the malnourished population with terrifying speed. You might wake up one morning feeling feverish, aching, and disoriented. At first, you might dismiss it as just the cold or the hunger, but soon the telltale signs appear: a rash, vomiting, severe diarrhea. There is little to no medical care available. Doctors are scarce, medical supplies are non-existent, and those who try to help are often quickly overwhelmed or fall sick themselves. You are left to suffer, surrounded by others doing the same. The air in the crowded shelters becomes thick with the smell of sickness, waste, and despair. The death rate during the early months of 1867 soared. People weren't just dying from starvation, they were dying from diseases that their weakened bodies simply couldn't fight off. A bout of dysentery that a healthy person might recover from could be a death sentence for someone already on the brink of starvation. The cold also claimed many lives, especially among those still traveling or sleeping outdoors. Hypothermia became a constant threat. Imagine trying to fight off a nasty flu while being permanently hungry and living in a freezer. That's roughly the situation. The scale of death became horrific. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried. Frozen ground made digging graves difficult. In many places, mass graves were dug, or bodies were simply left until the spring thaw. The social fabric began to fray under this immense pressure. Basic human decency became hard to maintain in the face of such overwhelming suffering. Stories emerged of people abandoning sick family members or focusing solely on their own survival. It's easy to judge from the comfort of your couch, but desperation changes people. During this peak period, the government response, while it was beginning to get organized, still lagged far behind the reality on the ground. Reports of widespread death and disease finally penetrated the bureaucratic layers in Helsinki. They understood this wasn't just a bad harvest, it was a national catastrophe. Efforts were made to import grain from Russia and other countries, but transportation remained a massive bottleneck. Shipments of grain would arrive in coastal ports, but getting it inland to the worst-hit areas was a logistical nightmare, especially in winter. Think of it like trying to distribute 1 million Thanksgiving turkeys across a frozen wilderness using only horse-drawn carts. It's going to take a while, and a lot of people aren't going to get one. Public works projects continued or were initiated with the intention of providing wages for food. Building roads, digging canals, these were often undertaken in brutally cold conditions by people who were barely strong enough to stand. The mortality rate among these labor gangs was extremely high. It was a cruel irony you could get a job to earn money for food, but the job itself might kill you before you could buy it. And even if you earned wages, finding food to buy was often impossible because local markets were empty or prices were astronomical. International aid was requested and did eventually start to arrive from countries like Sweden, Denmark, Germany, and even as far afield as Great Britain. Relief committees were formed both within Finland and abroad. These efforts raised funds and sent shipments of food and supplies. However, like government aid, international help also faced the same transportation challenges. It was a gesture of solidarity, a glimmer of light in the darkness, but the sheer volume of need dwarfed the aid available, at least in the initial critical months. Historians still argue whether the international aid, when it finally arrived in significant quantities, was truly effective in preventing further deaths during the peak of the crisis, or whether it primarily helped in the subsequent recovery phase. Some argue that while well-intentioned, the delays in transportation and the lack of infrastructure meant much of the aid arrived too late for those who died in the worst winter months. Others contend that every bit helped, and the psychological impact of knowing the outside world cared was significant. It's hard to put a statistic on hope or the lack of it. A mainstream historical fact that underscores the severity of this period is the dramatic spike in mortality statistics. The years 1867 and 1868 saw death rates in Finland that were unprecedented in modern times. In 1868 alone, the death rate was nearly double the average, and in some regions, it was 3, 4, or even 5 times higher. It's estimated that around 200,000 people died during these famine years, representing about 8% of the total population at the time. To put that in perspective, imagine if 8% of your country's population vanished in 2 years. That's a profound demographic and societal shock. The psychological toll on the survivors was immense. Witnessing such widespread death, the breakdown of social order, the constant struggle for survival, and the loss of family and friends left deep scars. The famine wasn't just a period of physical suffering, it was a collective trauma that would shape Finnish society for generations. Think about the stories that would be passed down, the deep-seated fear of scarcity, the memories of loved ones lost to hunger and disease. As the brutal winter continued, people's desperation led them to try and eat anything that might provide sustenance. The dwindling reserves of traditional food were long gone for many. You started to hear stories, or perhaps witnessed yourself, people consuming things that would normally be considered inedible. Moss-lichen tree bark, though perhaps not yet prepared in the way that would become infamous roots that were difficult to identify or digest, straw, even boiled leather. This frantic search for anything to put in your stomach highlights the extreme nature of the crisis. It wasn't about nutrition anymore. It was about silencing the unbearable demands of hunger, even for a few hours. A quirky tidbit that emerged from this desperate ingenuity is the documented use of certain types of moss and lichen as food extenders, or even primary sustenance. While some lichens contain carbohydrates, they are often difficult for humans to digest without proper processing, and they can contain toxic substances. People were essentially experimenting out of necessity, often with painful or fatal results. Imagine trying to make a meal out of something you'd normally see growing on a rock, hoping it won't kill you faster than starvation will. It's a grim testament to human resilience and desperation. Amidst this chaos, pockets of resilience and community support did emerge. Some local officials or priests worked tirelessly to organize what limited relief they could. Neighbors tried to help neighbors, sharing what little they had, though often this only prolonged the suffering for everyone. There were acts of extraordinary kindness and self-sacrifice amidst the widespread misery. It wasn't just a story of collapse. It was also a story of human spirit enduring against impossible odds. But for many, the odds were simply too great. By late winter and early spring of 1867, the death toll was peaking. The snow was still deep, the cold still severe, but the worst of the darkness, literally and figuratively, had arrived. The government's larger relief efforts, including more substantial grain imports and infrastructure projects, were still in their early stages or facing delays. The impact of international aid was limited by distribution challenges. The medical system was overwhelmed by disease. The country was reeling. If you've survived this far, are a shadow of your former self. You've witnessed horrors that will be etched into your memory forever. You've felt the absolute depths of hunger and cold. You've seen death all around you. Survival feels less like an achievement and more like a grim lottery win. The desperate journey, if you undertook it, might have led you to a place no better, perhaps even worse than where you started, trapped in a crowded, sick-ridden shelter. The faint promise of spring is still weeks or months away, and even spring brings its own set of challenges. The thaw will turn frozen roads into impassable mud. The diseases thriving in winter conditions will continue to spread, perhaps even worsen with the increased dampness. And the question of food for the coming year remains a terrifying unknown, especially for those who ate their seed grain just to survive the winter. This period, the height of the famine crisis in early 1867, was arguably the most devastating. The combination of starvation, extreme cold, and rampant epidemic disease created a perfect storm of mortality. The sounds of coughing, the silence of empty stomachs, the sight of too many graves. This is the reality you are living through, one agonizing day at a time. The absolute nadir, the deep freeze of suffering you endured through the early months of 1867, begins agonizingly slowly to loosen its grip. The biting winds still sweep across the land, but there are subtle shifts. The days almost imperceptibly at first begin to lengthen. The sun hangs slightly higher in the pale sky. A fragile hope buried under layers of snow and despair starts to stir within you, though you barely dare to acknowledge it. It feels dangerous to hope. Spring arrives not as a sudden burst of warmth and color, but as a messy, muddy transition. The frozen ground thaws, turning roads into quagmires and making travel still desperately needed for aid distribution incredibly difficult. The snow melts, revealing the grim truth of the winter's toll. Bodies that couldn't be buried in the frozen earth, fields that lie fallow, devoid of promise. The smell of damp earth mixes with the lingering odor of sickness and decay. It's a season of both tentative renewal and stark, unavoidable reckoning. Government efforts to import grain begin to bear more fruit, though distribution remains a headache. The logistical challenges of getting food to remote villages and scattered farms are immense, even without the added chaos of muddy roads. Think of it like trying to deliver groceries across a country-sized swamp with only ox carts. It's happening, but not quickly enough for everyone. International aid, too, increases, offering crucial supplements to the domestic efforts. You might finally see sacks of grain arriving, or perhaps shipments of seed for planting, which represents the most important hope for the future. With the spring comes the possibility of planting. If you were among the lucky few who managed to preserve some seed grain, or if you received seed from relief efforts, the backbreaking work begins. Trudging through muddy fields, your body still weakened by months of hunger and disease, you sow the seeds, praying for a harvest. It's an act of faith, a defiant gesture against the forces that brought you to your knees. But the trauma of the past year hangs heavy. What if the weather turns again? What if another pestilence strikes the crops? The anxiety is almost as consuming as the hunger used to be. Disease, unfortunately, doesn't magically disappear with the spring thaw. In fact, the warmer, wetter conditions can sometimes make things worse. Typhus and dysentery continue to plague the population, though perhaps not with the same ferocity as in the peak winter months. Survivors remain vulnerable, their immune systems compromised. Access to medical care is still virtually non-existent. You learn to fear the fever, the cough, the stomach cramps almost as much as starvation itself. The recovery is a slow, arduous process that stretches over years, not months. The famine didn't just kill people, it shattered communities, destroyed livelihoods, and left deep psychological scars. For you, the survivor, the experience is indelible. You've seen things you can never unsee. You've felt things that words can barely describe. The memory of constant hunger, the ache in your bones from the cold, the smell of death. These are etched into your being. Even when there is food, the fear of scarcity lingers. You might find yourself hoarding small amounts, unable to fully trust that the lean times are truly over. The experience of the famine prompts a serious reckoning within Finnish society and within the government of the Grand Duchy. The sheer scale of the disaster exposes critical weaknesses in infrastructure, administration, and social safety nets. There's a realization that this level of suffering should never happen again. Efforts are made to improve transportation networks, particularly railways and canals, to facilitate quicker movement of goods, including food in times of crisis. Agricultural practices are also reviewed with increased emphasis on diversification and methods less vulnerable to extreme weather. This period also sees a strengthening of civil society. The relief committees formed during the crisis continue their work transitioning from immediate aid to longer-term recovery efforts. There's a sense of national solidarity forged in shared suffering, a determination to build a more resilient future. However, this sense of unity doesn't erase the hardship. Rebuilding homes, restocking farms, finding work, healing the sick, it's a multi-generational task. Throughout the immediate aftermath and into the years that follow, one particular image, one particular food substitute remains a potent symbol of the famine's horrors: bark bread. You know it intimately, perhaps too intimately. You remember the scraping of the inner bark, the mixing with whatever meager flour was available, the bitter taste, the rough texture, the stomach cramps. It wasn't food in the nourishing sense. It was a desperate last resort attempt to quiet the screaming demands of an empty gut. It represents the ultimate degradation of dignity, the point where sustenance was sought from something inedible under normal circumstances. The memory of millions forced to rely on bark bread weighs heavily on the national consciousness. It's not just a memory of starvation. It's a memory of consuming something fundamentally wrong, something that should never have been necessary. As the food situation improves and the threat of starvation recedes, the idea of eating bark bread becomes not just unappealing, but abhorrent. It's something you did to survive, something you hope your children and their children will never have to experience. This collective trauma surrounding bark bread eventually leads to a rather specific and perhaps outside of Finland, a slightly quirky legislative outcome. While people naturally stopped eating bark bread when real food became available, the government, perhaps wanting to formally distance the nation from this symbol of desperation and ensure food standards, takes action. A law is eventually enacted that specifically regulates the composition of bread. It's not necessarily called the No Bark Bread Law, but its effect is to ensure that anything sold as bread meets certain quality and ingredient standards, effectively outlawing the commercial production or sale of bread containing significant amounts of bark or other indigestible fillers. This law, arising directly from the famine experience, serves as a formal line drawn in the sand. It's the state saying, never again should our people be reduced to eating that. It's a quiet administrative echo of the screams of hunger from just a few years prior. It feels almost anticlimactic after the scale of the suffering, a bureaucratic response to a primal scream. Imagine a law saying you can't sell bricks mixed with sawdust as housing materials after a major earthquake. It makes sense, but it feels small compared to the devastation that prompted it. A mainstream historical fact confirming the severity of the famine's impact beyond mortality is the significant emigration that followed. While there was some emigration before the famine years, and the subsequent difficulty of recovery spurred a wave of people leaving Finland in search of better opportunities, particularly to North America. This outflow of people further shaped the demographic landscape and serves as a testament to the long-lasting disruption caused by the crisis. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about finding a place where such a thing might never happen again. Historians still argue whether the long-term economic policies enacted after the famine, focused on industrialization and infrastructure development, were the most effective path to preventing future crises, or whether more could have been done to support small-scale agriculture and rural communities. Some point to the rapid modernization that followed as a direct, albeit painful, consequence of the famine's wake-up call, while others lament the continued vulnerability of certain segments of the population to economic downturns or agricultural failures. It's a complex legacy debated from the comfort of a historical distance. A quirky tidbit related to the post-famine period and the memory of bark bread is how it entered folklore and proverbs. The phrase "lepe juri cuoresta," bread root from bark, or similar expressions, became part of the language often used to denote extreme poverty, hardship, or a humiliating experience. It wasn't just a physical reality, it became a cultural marker, a symbol of hitting rock bottom. Your descendants might hear stories or use these phrases without fully grasping the visceral reality. You experienced the taste of that bitter, indigestible paste that kept you alive barely. The famine leaves an indelible mark on Finnish national identity. It's a shared experience of extreme hardship, resilience, and eventual recovery. The lessons learned about preparedness, infrastructure, and social welfare shape the development of the modern Finnish state. The memory of the lean years symbolized by that awful bark bread instills a deep-seated appreciation for security and sufficiency. You, the survivor, carry these memories, these fears, these hard-won lessons for the rest of your life. As the 1860s draw to a close and the 1870s begin, life gradually finds a new rhythm. The fields are replanted, the sounds of industry return, the markets slowly fill again. The wounds heal, but the scars remain. You might still find yourself instinctively scanning the ground for edible roots or plants, a habit born of desperation. You might still feel a pang of anxiety when the weather turns bad, but you survived, you endured. And in some small bureaucratic way, your suffering and the suffering of hundreds of thousands like you led to a law about what could and could not be called bread. A quiet promise etched in legislation that the bark would stay on the trees and bread would be bread again. Word account 2148, awaiting continue. Hey guys, tonight we journeyed back to a time and place where the simple act of finding something, anything to eat, meant the difference between life and death. We walked the frozen roads of Finland during the Great Famine of the 1860s, felt the gnawing emptiness in our stomachs, and tasted the bitter reality of bark bread. It's a stark reminder that history isn't always about kings and battles. Sometimes it's about the brutal reality of survival against the elements and circumstance. You probably won't survive this story without drifting off, and honestly, that's the goal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling up to it, drop a comment below with where you're listening from and what time it is. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story wraps up now, doesn't it? We've followed you through the desperate planting, the slow, messy recovery, the long shadow cast by those terrible years. The fields yielded their harvest, life returned piece by painstaking piece. The memory of bark bread faded from necessity to symbol, eventually prompting that quiet legislative correction. Your world slowly stabilized, healing in fits and starts, marked forever by the hardship you endured. It's time now to let that world recede, to allow the images of frozen landscapes and empty stomachs to soften at the edges. You are safe now here in the present, far from the cold grasp of that history. The hunger is gone, the chill is absent. All that remains is the echo of the story, a faint whisper on the edge of sleep. Let the weight of it lift. Feel the comfort of your bed, the warmth of your blankets. The journey is complete. You can rest now. Let your mind quiet the thoughts, slow down, the historical figures and facts dissolve into the stillness. Breathe softly, that's right. Just let go. Sleep will find you now.